Today, it's the last event organized at the center. We're hosting another event in May, 2 weeks from now, on AI, which is co-organized with Colin Allen's group. But it's our last official event organized by the center. It's a really wonderful pleasure to have this workshop on our colleague Jim Woodward's most recent book, Causation with a Human Face, Normative Theory and Descriptive Psychology. Some of us have gone through the original antecedent versions, the previous versions of the book, and so it's really a pleasure to see actually the book as a final product here. We are delighted to have two people commenting today on the book. Jinan Ismail, who is right here, who will start the workshop, and she will be followed by Tobias Gerstenberg, who is here and will be the second contributor to the workshop. Jim Woodward will give a response after to our two commentators, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So the plan here is to have 45-minute presentation, then we'll move to the second commentator. Jim will give a response, and then we'll have plenty of time, we believe, for discussion. It's my great pleasure to introduce, or I should say reintroduce, because Jinan has been with us now 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, I suppose. Jinan Ismail, who is a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. She works, as you might remember, or as you know if you were not with us then, in the philosophy of physics, the philosophy of science, but also in cognitive science. She has written many articles, and I won't go through them, but I will mention her 3 books. The most recent one, I believe anyway, is A Very Short Introduction with OUP. Is that correct? Is that the most recent one? Good. In 2021, in 2016, she wrote a book that really made a splash, was widely discussed, both in philosophy, but also outside philosophy by newspapers. How Physics Make Us Free. I think the New York Times had a discussion of it, I believe. Forbes. Gets very blurry. Pre-COVID times, it's all one big unspecific memory. And before, she had a really great book about the self and its situation, its embodiment and situation for the situated self in 2007. Also, it's a pleasure to have you back here at the center. Well, yours.
So I couldn't be happier to be here and to be discussing a book that I think is just a sort of huge achievement. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by mostly just describing the way that I see Jim's project in the book, and then I'll ask a question. So it's probably unnecessary here, but just a quick summary of what Jim is up to in the book. So he's bringing together discussion in psychology, statistics, computer science, and philosophy, and he's examining the contours of causal judgment. So looking at empirical facts about how people actually judge and reason about causal relationships. He's giving a functional account of causal thinking. So looking at the role that causal thinking plays in our cognitive and practical lives, and then trying to understand why the judgments and patterns of reasoning that we exhibit make sense given the function of causal thinking. And here he's in opposition to a philosophical tradition that thinks of itself as discovering what causation is, where that's to be understood in a specifically metaphysical kind of inquiry. So standard practice in this literature is to start with some account of the world that doesn't explicitly mention causal relations, elicit intuitions about hypothetical cases, and then try to use those intuitions to zero in on what in the world as described by whatever your favorite, whatever the favorite ontology is, what causal relationships are in that world. So for example, we're told familiarly Susie and Billy throw rocks at a bottle. Susie's rock gets there first, the bottle shatters. Billy's rock would have broken the bottle if Susie's hadn't, and you're supposed to share the intuition that Susie's rock caused the breaking. That becomes then a datum to be captured by your account of what causal relations are. You're told Pam and Bob throw rocks at an aquarium. Bob sees Pam aiming and holds his rock. he would have thrown if he hadn't seen her. Meanwhile, there's a crack in the aquarium that Jonah was going to fix, and so on. You get the idea. These examples get more and more Baroque. There's a kind of proliferation of increasingly Baroque and contrived examples that are intended to tease out distinctions in our causal intuitions. One person offers an analysis, another person constructs a counterexample. People with different metaphysical starting points then wield their success at capturing these intuitions against opponents as sort of a victory for their ontology. This is mostly done from the armchair. Jim isn't that interested in intuitions about artificial cases, and he's not that interested in metaphysics. So what he's doing is he's saying, I'm going to look at the patterns of judgment that people actually display out in the wild, where people judge there's a causal relationships, the kinds of distinctions they make among different types of causal relationships, the preferences that they show in their reasoning about these relationships. And he says, and I'm going to try to understand why these practices make sense, these practices of reasoning and judging as we do, by just thinking about the function of causal reasoning. So investigation in psychology, in XFI, and even some of this intuition-based analysis can all be kind of brought into the fold for Jim as investigating the contours of our causal thinking. Where when we consult our intuitions about cases from the armchair, according to Jim, we're not gaining rational insight into the nature of causation. What we're doing is we're generating data about the contours of causal thinking. We're saying, I judge thus and so in this sort of case, and I expect that others will too. Then that gets explained by seeing why it would make sense, given the function of causal thinking, for our judgments to have those kinds of contours. What is the function of causal thinking according to Jim? Well, we're agents. We have certain interests and limitations. We have an interest in predicting and controlling the environment. The world is full of regularities. Some hold only locally and under special conditions. Some have wider scope. Some are loose, some are strict. Some can only be used for prediction, but some can be exploited for purposes of manipulation and control. We search out those pathways strategically, manipulating local features of our environment to bring about distal ends. So although Jim doesn't really insist in the book on the interventionist account of the content of causal claims, much of he says in the book, for example, can be embraced by other kinds of analyses, counterfactual analyses of various sorts, regularity analyses. But I think things are especially illuminating and clear if one is thinking in interventionist terms. So for the interventionist, of course, causal regularities are the ones that support or entail interventionist counterfactuals. There's a causal influence of A on B just in case intervening on A, that is reaching in and inducing a change on A in a way that randomizes its connections to causal antecedents, just in case that kind of an intervention raises the probability of B. So it's sort of straightforwardly clear on an interventionist analysis that causal regularities are the ones that can be used for manipulation and control. So if we wanted to put this in cognitive terms, we could say, we could characterize the functional role of causal information by its role in practical reasoning. Causal information supplies beliefs that we need to make decisions. So when you ask, what should I do? What would happen if I A'd rather than B'd? Your decision to A rather than B has to be treated as an intervention because it will be, that is, your decision will be determined, guided, or influenced by your preferences among the effects of your A'ing rather than B'ing. So of course, it's not guaranteed that you will do what you decide. And it's not guaranteed that your decisions are not influenced by other things, or sorry, that your actions are not influenced by other things than your decisions or than your preferences, but whatever contribution your decision makes to the determination of your action. To the extent that your decision goes by way of your assessment of what would happen if you A'd rather than B'd, in order to make the decision, you need an assessment of what would happen if you A'd rather than B'd that treats your A'ing rather than B'ing as a free variable. So this is subtle, but I think it's an important point. You don't have to justify the claim that your actions are interventions, that is, that human action effectively randomizes connections to causal antecedents, though it does, or it comes close to doing. Nor do you have to think that your actions are fully determined by your decisions. You might think there are all kinds of subpersonal influences on what you end up doing. But all you really need is to think that your decisions play a role in the determination of your action, and that your decision is determined in part by your assessment of the effects of your A'ing rather than B'ing. If that's the logic of the situation, then decision demands a clean assessment of what deciding to A rather than B would add to all of the other things that are already in place. Because whether you decide to A depends on your assessment of those effects. So insofar as decision opens up, deliberation opens up a space for teleological thinking to play a role in the determination of action, it demands causal thinking in the interventionist sense, in Jim's sense. So here's the structure of the situation. So suppose 8 here is my action and 6 is my decision. We assume that you might think that there are a lot of other things that are going to play a role in the determination of action. So a lot of different causal factors, but insofar as my decision is one of those, and insofar as my decision is determined by my assessment of the effects on action, I need an assessment of the effects of my decision that treat it as an intervention. I'm not looking for evidence of what will happen. I want to know what my decision adds to what's already in place. Only the latter will provide a reason for deciding to A rather than B. So the recognition that our decisions have effects that we can anticipate opens up the space for strategically exploiting those effects. And that's what causal thinking plays a role in assessing. So a lot of Jim's book is exploring the complex ways in which the descriptive project and the normative projects are intertwined. So the ways in which the descriptive and normative parts of the examination of causal thinking inform one another if one treats causal thinking functionally. So for example, we can ask, what's the point of distinguishing causal from non-causal correlations? What's the point of distinguishing among different types of causal correlations? Why do we show a preference for causal relations that are invariant or proportional, for example? Does this make sense given what causal thinking is for? Facts about how people actually judge can also suggest norms that we hadn't noticed. And the functional characterization of causal thinking can suggest patterns that we can then check experimentally to see if people's judgments actually exhibit. With the function of causal inference in mind, we can formalize patterns of causal inference and begin to look at ways of crafting better tools to serve the purposes for which we engage in causal thinking. So this is all part of the book. So far I've focused on the role that causal thinking plays for the agent, but Jim is adamant that causal structure is worldly structure, and investigating causal structure is investigating the world. It's not investigating ourselves. The sense in which causation has a human face is that human goals and purposes and limitations play an essential role in the account of why we go in for causal thinking. why we care about causal structure. There's an analogy here with food. So not Jim's analogy, but one that I like. So food is stuff that plays a certain role in our lives. Our lives are organized around identifying and obtaining food, some of us more than others. But it's absolutely central and important category of stuff for us. To understand why it plays such a central role in our representations of the world and in organizing our practical activity, you need to understand something about us. I mean, about human beings and about their relationship to the world. You need to know a lot of quite specific stuff about our physiology, about our practical interests, and so on. But food is in the world. The investigation of food and the understanding of what makes it suited to play the role that it does in our lives is a thoroughly empirical matter, and it's an empirical matter that's focused outside of us. Okay, so the book is so rich, I think it's hard to pick out a single thing to focus on. So much of the commentary, so far on the book has been really down in the weeds, applying the functional approach to different aspects of causal thinking, or discussing Jim's application of the functional approach in later chapters of the book. So he applies the functional approach to understanding invariants in chapters 5 to 7. So the preference for causal relationships that are invariant across a wide range of circumstances, centered on the ones that we think of as normal circumstances. And then in chapter 8, he's looking at proportionality. So that's the preference that people show for causal relationships where there's a match between variation in the cause and variation in the effect. And the fruitfulness of this sort of inquiry, which is for Jim, the real test of the success of the functional approach, is sort of on ample display in the book and in the kind of the wake of the publication in the book and the exchanges that have gone on. I'm gonna go in a slightly different direction. And I'm gonna look at the programmatic aspects of the book to say sort of what's really exciting to me about the book. So I'm gonna switch now from the way that Jim describes what he's doing to my own voice. And then I'm going to ask a question about something that I'm really keen to understand a little bit better from Jim. So what's exciting to me about the book is that it provides a sort of beautifully executed exemplar of a new way of doing naturalistic metaphysics. So here's how I see what Jim is doing. He's saying, look, if we want to understand causation, we make causal thinking the focus of attention. We start by making the embedded agent and the cognitive and practical activity in which causal concepts figure the focus of inquiry. So that's the starting point. We look at the role that causal thinking plays in the coupled exchange between agent and environment. The inquiry should tell us about the internal role of the concept. What role does it play in thinking? What are its connections to other concepts? What sorts of inferences does it license? It should tell us about the connections to perception and to action, the relationships between the agent and the environment. And it should tell us about the external infrastructure in the world that supports the use of that concept. But that's it. That's the whole story about causation. There isn't any remaining question, any specifically metaphysical question that remains to be answered once all of those pieces of the puzzle have been filled in. So there are lots of things that fall under the umbrella of this kind of inquiry. From a psychological perspective, for example, one can examine the contours of causal thinking, how we actually do it, the role it plays in practical reasoning, what it looks like when it's functioning well, the ways in which it's prone to break down. One might also be interested, for example, in how causal thinking develops, the differences cross-culturally among different groups in causal reasoning. Philosophers of science and practitioners will be interested in methodology, so questions of causal search and discovery, questions of inference and justification, how we identify causal relationships, what kinds of evidence count as evidence for a causal claim, and so on. Philosophers of physics will be very interested in what I've called the external infrastructure that supports causal thinking, so the physics that underwrites causal pathways. So Jim is non-committal about this part of the project. What he says is, whatever fundamental ontology of the world is, it is such as to support what would happen if facts of the type involved in causal claims. It is these that we represent and reason about when we engage in causal inference and judgment. But it's a total set, like in the volleyball sense, because now the physicist can say, I have a theory about what the fundamental ontology is. I can tell you what supports those facts if you cast them in a form that I can recognize. So there's been this debate for a long time in philosophy of science about the status of causal notions in a physics-based worldview. So we approach our understanding, people approach their understanding of the world pre-theoretically with causal ideas. They're sort of central to human understanding of the world. Our most basic experience of the world involves causal exploration. So we learn how things work by intervening and observing the results of our intervention. The child who pulls a lever on her mobile is launching a primitive experiment. And this process of intervening and observing the results of our interventions is more or less continuous from the crib to the lab. But the status of causal ideas has been contested, of course, since Russell's 1913 paper, where he observed that physical laws don't have or don't seem to have any intrinsic asymmetry. And they're moreover sort of global. They don't look anything like the local relations of asymmetric determination that we associate with causation. They don't involve any kind of compulsive transfer of force. Russell himself thought that we should just get rid of causal ideas, so treat them as a folk notion in favor of laws. Some people have followed him here. But most people have thought that causal ideas are indispensable both to science and to everyday practical reasoning. So it's been an open question how to fit them into a physics-based worldview. And the question reemerged in the interest surrounding the physical basis of temporal asymmetries in the foundations of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. But to get any traction on that question, one needs a characterization of causal relationships that makes some contact with physics. If one looks at the philosophical literature on causation, one finds all of these people talking about Susie and Bob and rocks and bottles. There's a kind of also a sort of obsession with the semantics for counterfactuals, where those are tailored to capture the ways in which we tend to judge. And the focus is really, on things that are difficult to associate with physics. So these are some of the reasons, not all of them, but some of the reasons that it doesn't look like it has something that when a physicist looks at the philosophical literature on causation, that literature doesn't look like it has something that a physicist will recognize as having factual content. So in that respect, I think the interventionist analysis is a huge advance. A physicist looking at the interventionist analysis can say, I see, from the point of view of physics, causal relationships are scaffolded intervention supporting relationships among the values of variables. They're the first things that we get a hold of in our everyday causal exploration. But they're also the kinds of physical relationships captured in DAGs that we establish in the laboratory. The physical explanation of any given causal relationship will demand, on the one hand, making explicit a lot of the structure that defines the relationship. So we're going to have to say, when you establish an interventionist causal relationship, you have to specify a network of variables, you have to specify constraints or scaffolding in the environment, you have to specify a range of invariants that the causal relationship holds. But once all of that is characterized precisely enough, in physical terms, we do have a physical relationship between variables in the presence of constraints, and that's the kind of thing that permits physical explanation. So although the physical explanation proceeds, when we give a physical explanation, it proceeds from laws and more fundamental structures to causal relationships, which are these sort of surface pathways between the values of variables against the background of constraints. The direction of inquiry actually proceeds from causal relations to laws. So as Jim says, we start with only local invariant relationships. And then in some cases, we generalize and refine them into more and more invariant relationships, rather than thinking in terms of exceptionalist laws from the outset. Exceptionalist laws, if discoverable at all, are thus an extreme or limiting case of invariant generalizations, with the latter, that is invariant generalizations, being the more generic notion. So what the search for laws does is it actually organizes and systematizes. Laws allow us to get deep and precise and explicit understanding of the laws and processes that underlie the patchwork of variously invariant relationships that we discover with empirical inquiry. A good physical theory will delimit the surface level causal pathways. It will give us a precise and articulated understanding of the substructure and the scaffolding that supports various causal pathways. So we have this nice sort of closing of the circle. Epistemically, we see a path from our crude apprehension of surface pathways down to deep laws. The direction of explanation from within a physical theory then proceeds from deep laws up to the locally invariant relationships that emerge when the conditions are precisely enough specified. So we can ask some very broad questions about causal relationships. So we can ask, for example, why all known causal pathways run from the past to the future, since there's nothing in the generic characterization of causal relations that is scaffolded intervention supporting pathways that has a temporal orientation built into it. And that's the kind of thing that one hopes that statistical mechanics can illuminate. But beyond that, it will be all specificity. There are all kinds of scaffolded regularities that support intervention counterfactuals. If we ask, what is the physics that underwrites this or that causal relationship, the answers that we get will be as complex and as various as the many different kinds of relationships captured in DAGs. So as complex and varied as the physics that underwrites the causal connection between the striking and the lighting of a match, the consumption of aspirin and the relief of headaches, inflation, and consumer spending. The point of all of this is that there are all kinds of interesting questions that we can investigate when we treat causal thinking as an adaptive strategy by embedded creatures in a world like ours. But all of the factual questions get sorted out by filling in the pieces of this empirical puzzle. There are no philosophical mysteries if one is thinking in these terms. There's a kind of parallel story to be told about probabilities. And it's useful to see it together with causal thinking. So probabilistic thinking is an adaptive strategy by limited creatures who use patterns in the phenomena to guide expectation in the face of ignorance. Any stabilized relative frequency with the right sort of microstructure can license a probability assignment Once one has a probability assignment, it can be used to guide expectation in the absence of specific information. One expects that physics will be able to explain any given stabilized regularity, stabilized relative frequency, but as in the case of causation, the physics that underwrites this sort of vast array of stabilized relative frequencies will be complex and it will be varied. It will be all specificity. So virtues of this kind of explanation. It's entirely naturalistic. The investigation is an empirical one from beginning to end. It makes room for complexity of function in concepts. I'm tempted to adopt this as a new way of doing metaphysics. We'll call it metaphysics with a human face. Here's how it works. We're interested in some concept. In cases that we've talked about, say causation, probability. We situate the agent in the world. We start by making the embedded agent and the cognitive and practical activity in which the concept features the focus of inquiry. Now, this is going to require understanding the agent, her needs and her abilities and so on, and also understanding the world. And then we take a sort of side-on view and we look at the role that the concept plays in the coupled exchange between agent and environment. The inquiry should tell us about what there is on the side of the agent. It should tell us about the internal role of the concept. And it should tell us about the external infrastructure in the environment that supports its use. In some cases, that story will be simple and straightforward, but in some cases, it will be more complex. In some cases, it will be enough to include the natural environment, the agent embedded in the natural environment. In some cases, we'll need to widen our scope and include the social environment as well. So for example, concepts of meaning or concepts like good and bad. But in any case, that's all there is. There's the agent, the environment, and the coupled interaction between them. The account should give us an understanding of what the concept is doing and the facts about the world that support its use. But that story won't always take the form of saying that the concept represents some feature in the environment, or that that's all it does. Or the idea of representation is going to have to be deflated or expanded beyond the paradigm so that we're not sort of beyond the paradigm of kind of standing for some feature of the environment, so that we're not forced into this trap that old style naturalistic metaphysics fell into. And it's easiest to see the trap that I'm talking about if we look at the sort of old research program schematized by Canberra style metaphysics. So it's a little bit out of date, but it's still helpful to see as a foil because it still organizes much of the activity in analytic metaphysics. So one can see the outline clearly in the literature on causation. Here's how it works. You collect platitudes about a concept. In some cases, these are the set of taken for granted truths that competent users can be expected to agree on. In some cases, as in the case of causation, it's judgments about the extension of the concept. Then you look for something that then you construct a Ramsey sentence, putting a variable in wherever the concept in question appears. And then you look for something that satisfies the sentence in your preferred ontological base. The platitudes or the intuitions about cases are serving as an implicit definition of the concept. And what you're effectively doing is looking for an explicit characterization in the terms provided by your ontology. When you think of, when you're doing metaphysics that way, you have three options. You can reduce, so you can find something in your ontological base that satisfies the Ramsey sentence. You can reify. You can say, I don't see anything that satisfies the sentence, so I'm going to add it in to my ontology as a primitive. I'm going to expand my ontological base. Or you can reject it. You can say what we found is that my preferred ontology, physics or whatever, shows us that there is nothing. There is no such thing. The problem with this is that the way that we individuate content and the standards of what counts as a successful reduction in a way conspire to force us to reify aspects of content that aren't best understood in representational terms. Concepts have complex functions. They have connections to other concepts and to perception and action. They have roles in epistemic and practical reasoning. Where there's an external component that supports the use of a concept, it's not always right, or it's not always complete to say that the concept represents that feature of the world. So think about probabilities, for example. Again, probabilities have a worldly component that licenses application, namely stabilized relative frequencies with the right kind of microstructure. And they have a practical component that licenses inference. So if you have a probability assignment, in the absence of specific information, you can use it to guide expectation. So in that case, what there is in the world are stabilized relative frequencies, some of which have the right structure to support a probability assignment. And again, when we have a probability assignment, we can use it to license expectation. But when people ask, what are probabilities? And they look in the world for something that, for probabilities statements to represent, they find that, well, first, no actual frequency has all of the properties of probabilities. And then they get themselves tied in knots. They start talking about hypothetical long-run frequencies. But even there, we don't get a strict identity between probabilities and frequencies because of the law of large numbers always leaves room for the possibility of divergence. The suggestion here is that those knots are unnecessary. The whole story about probabilities is the external frequencies, the licensing of a probability statement, and the use of probability to guide expectation. You don't need to explicate all aspects of content by finding something in the world for it to represent. Even where there is a substantial external component that supports their use, like the existence of stabilized relative frequencies of the right sort, it's not always right to say that probabilities or whatever the concept is in question represents that component. So that then brings me to something that the question that I have for Jim. The thing that I don't understand is how Jim thinks about modality in general. I'm really keen to understand what your view is here. So there's no way around the fact that the world is modal, that our understanding of the world is modal through and through. We know some things about the past, some particular facts about the past. We use those to extract predictions, both about what will happen and about what would happen under hypothetical conditions and hypothetical interventions. Causal beliefs, like beliefs about capacities, dispositions, affordances, and even laws, encode such facts, some of these modal facts, and we use them to guide action. When an agent looks out at the world, she sees a landscape rife with latent possibility. And the notion of possibility here is different from the purely epistemic notion of possibility, might be the case so far as I know. And it's also different, I think, from the counterfactual notion, the idea of the non-actual possible. It's the notion of an actualizable possibility. I think if we are asking where our concept of possibility comes from, this is the most basic notion of non-epistemic possibility that we have, the one that gets extended outward and anchors other notions of possibility, including, of course, the ones that go into distinguishing causal from non-causal correlations. The old Canberra plan style metaphysics asks, what are the possibilities? Or how do we understand the specifically modal contents of concepts like probability or cause or law? And it gives us three options. It says reduce, reify, or reject. The Humean adopts the first option. He wants to say that the modal content reduces to facts about patterns in the manifold of actual events. I don't think that's right, and neither does Jim. Our ideas about physical possibility are extracted from patterns in the manifold of actual events, but they don't represent those patterns. We need modal beliefs for practical reasoning. We need to know what would happen under an array of possibilities, only one of which will be actual. And the reasoning that takes us from patterns in the manifold of actual events to their modal implications is ampliative reasoning. We get new beliefs out of it. Others take the second option. So some embrace primitive modal facts. Others hold that there are possible worlds that serve as truth makers for modal facts. Other people simply reject modal facts. But the presumption has been that reducing or reifying are the only ways to be realists about modality. So I've tried to thread this needle in a slightly different way by saying that this notion of possibility should be explicated non-representational. So the idea is that you acknowledge that modal thinking is ineliminable and ampliative for the embedded agent, but you explicate that extra content by looking at the role modal beliefs play in deliberation and the agent's own role in making some of the actual facts actual, without appealing to non-deflationary representational relations to anything in the external environment. So an agent making decisions needs to know what would happen under various possibilities. She runs through those in her mind in the course of decisions. What she decides depends in part on her assessment of the outcomes. She forms her ideas about that is about what would happen under various possibilities for intervention, with informal causal exploration at first, and eventually with science, which plays the role of a very sophisticated kind of expert in guiding her modal beliefs. There has to be certain kinds of regularity in the world to support that project. And those regularities have to have a particular kind of structure. But I don't think we need to find something in the world for the modal content to stand for or to represent, at least in a non-deflationary way. I don't think that there is anything objectionably anti-realist about this. The future cannot be given to us as an actuality, as something that is there to be known. It has to be given to us in the form of potential, because it is our decisions that are going to make the difference between one future and another. The concept of potential, for us, in this sense, precedes the concept of the actual, and it permeates every aspect of our view of the world. It's conceptually prior in the sense that, because at least when thinking about our own futures, our concept of what is actual goes through our concept of potential. You can say all of this without reifying the modal content in the world by asking what it stands for or represents. But Jim doesn't like that. He contrasts his view with me and with Hugh Price, who holds a similar view, I think. And he says, roughly speaking, their idea is that focusing on the function of causal thinking should lead us to recognize that some of the content of causal claims, in particular their distinctively modal commitments, doesn't have to do with the representation or doesn't reflect information about what is in the world. So I can only speak for myself. And to some extent, Hugh Price and I differ, but I think that Hugh would agree with me that that sort of bracketed phrase is just not right, at least as a description of our view. Of course, it reflects information about the world. Modal beliefs are beliefs that we form on the basis of actual facts in the world. The method for forming those beliefs is casual causal explanation, culminating in science. It is correct that the modal content shouldn't be understood representationally to the extent that representational thinking demands that you reify or reduce. To the extent that it demands that you think that there's something in the world that modal beliefs stand for, in the way that cow stands for cows. But so that's my question for Jim. If you don't like this idea, then what do you think here? What more do you think there is? Why do you think that there's more to modal?
Okay, you all want to know the answer to the question, but you're gonna have to wait 45 minutes before getting it.
I'm not good at it.
Oh, but you have to wait.
Well, I will say some things about it.
I'm sure you will. Thank you. All right, while we're getting ready, let me introduce our second speaker, Tobias Gerstenberg, who is an assistant professor of psychology at Stanford University. Tobias works on a range of topics, but primarily on causal thinking and causal cognition. He's also been doing a lot of work on moral psychology and to some extent on the way the two interact or intersect. He's published in all the best journals in psychology. One of the weird things with Tobias is that he works with philosophers, which shows a great breadth of mind and a tolerance for very annoying people. He's published recently with our friend Tobias, and I just wanted to flag out a few of his recent papers that I really like. It's just a paper in 22 called Inference from Explanation in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, which is really a great paper. I think Laura Kirchhoff, right?
That's right. She's a postdoc with me now.
She's a postdoc with you. Yeah.
Now.
She's also a friend. She's also been working with experimental philosophers, which show even a broader mind, a willingness to tolerate even more annoying people, and also moral dynamics, published also this year in Cognition. And a few years ago, I think last year, he published a paper in Journal of Experimental Philosophy, arguing in part against a paper that David Danks and I had written about causal cognition based on visual stimuli, which has a great piece of work. So it's really a pleasure to have you here, and thanks for coming today.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction and everyone for joining in to celebrate the book together. So it's really a pleasure that I can be here. I tried to be here in February and that didn't happen because of the winter storm. As I'm sure you remember, so I'm glad it's happening this time. So you already got a philosopher's perspective of Jim's book, and now it's a pleasure for me to give you the psychologist's perspective of his work. And just a little bit, by way of background, so I'm at Stanford University now and leading there the Causality and Cognition Lab. What we do in the lab is we're interested in how in people's concepts or understanding of causality and how it features in the way in which people understand the world and how they understand each other. So we're interested in how people learn about the causal structure of the world, how once they have that knowledge, how they can use it to reason about the world, to make predictions, give explanations, make inferences about the past. And how it also, as Edouard was saying, grounds out in the kind of judgments that people might reach in their everyday life, such as assigning responsibility or holding each other morally responsible. So I made first contact with Jim, so not with Jim, but with a book that Jim wrote during my master's. I did a master's at a university college, UCL in London. And there were two books that I think had a tremendous impact on my thinking. This was one of them. And then the other one was by Judea Pearl, Causality. So it came out around the same time, right? And both of which were extremely exciting for me, but also very difficult to understand as a psychologist, like by training. And I spent much of my time, I think, since to learn more to kind of understand these pieces of work like a little bit better. And you'll also see like throughout the presentation, because I'm trying to draw some connections between what Jim has been developing and some of the work that I've been doing, you'll see the many ways in which it's actually shaped my thinking. Here are a few very concrete ones. So this was the title of my dissertation, which is almost actually stolen from Jim's book, Making a Difference, Making Things Happen. It's more or less the same. And then to my dismay, I recently found out also here's our lab homepage. And that's basically the image stolen from Jim's book as well, which I hadn't remembered actually that it had that image, because I think I had like a library version that didn't actually have like the actual image of the book on it. But you see, in one way or another, it had a really big influence on many of the things that I'm doing. The first real contact, so not with the book, but with the contact in Jim, the person, was through my advisor, David Lanyado. He was a PhD advisor. He's at University College London, and also just recently published a wonderful book called Explaining the Evidence, here with his cat in the background, that I can also highly recommend. And so we met for the first time in David Lanyado's living room, not living room, sorry. That book is probably in the living room, in his office. And I got to share some of the work that I'd been doing like back then, which also, as Edward was pointed out, was about the question of how people assign responsibility and how they do it when there's groups of people collectively, or individuals in a group collectively contributing to some outcome. And the question might be how much each person individually was responsible for that outcome. So an interesting question of causation, because there's many ways in which people's individuals' contributions can combine, redundancy, overdetermination, all sorts of things can happen. And I was very excited to share that work with Jim, and he was very encouraging. And so that has, stayed with me. Also, I wanted to say just what an exciting time, I guess it is, to be thinking about causality. So just a few things, here picked just from things that came to mind at me here, obviously, because Guido Imbens is at Stanford. So that's a big deal, right? Essentially getting a Nobel Prize for causality. Jim's book, Judea Pearl's book, also they're kind of interestingly in sync, the two of them, roughly with, when they're publishing important books on causation. Joe Halpin's book on causality, another great book here by Nick Huntington Klein. So I teach statistics at Stanford. So that's another wonderful piece that came out. Then my former advisor's book. And also when you're in Silicon Valley, you can't help but notice that there's a lot of money being put into projects and startups that are really interested in trying to think more carefully about causality. Obviously a big push in DeepMind and these kinds of models, but also people really want to build responsible, understandable, interpretable AI. So there's a lot of influence on that. Before this book, now, the Causation with the Human Face, it's been a while, I think, that I really read like a full book, and particularly a philosophy book. So here's just some evidence that that's actually happened. Here's evidence of me reading the book. Here's some more evidence, maybe better evidence of me reading the book, some actual notes. And then here's some evidence that I maybe didn't read all of the footnotes in the book. There are a lot of footnotes, and some of them maybe on the flight back, I will dig into. Also, just a little bit, I want to highlight some of the ways in which I'm going to be relating now to the content. So there are a lot of things that I loved about it. I'm going to indicate this with this, big heart. And then there were also some things that I loved about it, but that I think I have something to say about. So then I'm going to use the stethoscope like for that. And then I'm also going to often give, Jim the word himself. So here's the dedication of the book, and it'll be obvious, when it's Jim. It'll be him and a quote. So the first thing I loved about the book is the cover, like Causation with a Human Face. And one of the things that I love about it, I think also making some connection to Jinan's work, is that I think it nicely illustrates here the way in which we are, thinking about the causal world, how it's often a very mundane task, such as, filling in something, I don't know whether it's milk or something, pouring in the liquid from one container into another, right? And that is the way in which we interact with our everyday life. And some of the things that I'm going to show you are kind of grounded also in this, what people in cognitive science call people's intuitive understanding of physics, how they think about the physical world. Here's just an example of some experiments that people did on actually thinking about how people think about liquids, right? How they fall and what predictions they can make about where things are going to end up. Jim, when he talks about the cover of his book and the title of the book, he says the title as well as the cover of this book reflects my conviction that in understanding causal cognition and causation itself, it is crucial to appreciate that causal reasoning is an activity carried out by humans. So obviously, as a psychologist here, that gets a heart from me. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to roughly, follow the book, but it's a long book, 400 pages roughly. So I'm only going to give you like a taster of the different themes. And I want to kind of point out in some sense how these themes have influenced my thinking and how they relate to some of the work that I've been doing. And hopefully you'll find that interesting. So the first part is also, like Jinan has already pointed out, a big theme is about that relationship between the normative and the descriptive, right? And that move essentially from maybe not asking so much more anymore what is causation, but rather putting kind of what is causation for, like making that for the emphasis. And I can at least speak for people in cognitive science that this loop, this interaction between the normative and the descriptive has been extremely fruitful, has helped inform a lot of experiments, right? We love as psychologists having normative theories because it gives us an excuse to run an experiment and to see to what extent people are complying with the normative theory, or maybe if we see deviations from the normative theory, but we still realize that people are actually getting along pretty well in the world, well, then maybe something's not quite right about the normative theory, right? And there's been many instances where that has happened, where maybe for some period of time, logic was held as the normative standard for reasoning, maybe moving on to probability theory as a standard for normative standard for reasoning. And if you do that, you see all sorts of deviations. But then if you come in and build something more maybe causal, structured as the normative framework for reasoning, suddenly the descriptive seems to be aligning much more closely. So there's something interesting happening there, I think. Quite concretely, interventionism as a normative framework has had a big effect on the work in causal cognition. So here's a quote from Jim again: "Why should we think causally at all? And why in doing so should we employ some particular way of thinking about causation?" So why treat observations and interventions differently about the world, you may ask? So people do that, right? They reason differently about, make different inferences based on observing the world versus either themselves intervening in the world or seeing somebody else intervene on the world. And you might say, okay, why is this useful? Well, it just turns out that having a causal model of how the world works in our minds is incredibly useful. And that's not that we can go further than Jim here and give some of the credits to Kenneth Craig in philosophy. So he says that the organism carries a small scale model of external reality and of its own possible actions within its head. It is able to try out various alternatives, conclude which is the best of them, nicely relating also to Jinan's points, react to future situations before they arise, utilize the knowledge of past events in dealing with the present and the future, and in every way to react in a much fuller, safer, and more competent manner to the emergencies which they face, or which face it. And so now as a cognitive scientist, right, I'm interested, I love that idea, but then I'm interested to think about a little bit more, to investigate more what this mental model of the world actually looks like. And that's, I'm going to take the bridge to the second part on theories of causation. So Jim outlines the landscapes of the kinds of theories of causation that are out there in philosophy, and they're broadly classified in the difference-making kind, right? And then what he calls the geometrical mechanical theories, or sometimes also called process theories or actualist theories of causation. And then there's various different kinds of these difference-making theories. And of course, he favors the interventionist of these different kinds. And then he also talks about the kind of artifacts that we as the community have developed in making these ideas a little bit more concrete. And I think these artifacts have been incredibly important. They've really helped, crosstalk like between the different disciplines. Now, economists, computer scientists, philosophers, and psychologists, and probably many others, epidemiologists, can all talk to each other because they have a common language which they can understand to communicate with. And it's nice that I get to invited to go to book release events and other kind of workshops. There was a legal workshop at some time that I went to where they were just interested in a Supreme Court case on kind of essentially overdetermination and how to treat it. And people from all sorts of different areas came together. So I'm a big fan of these kind of representations, but nevertheless, they get a stethoscope from me. And the reason why is that I think that the way in which people represent the world, their mental causal models of the world often go beyond the way in which we can capture the knowledge with these representations. Not saying that these representations are not good, I think they're great, but if our target of analysis is the kind of representations and computations that people are performing when they're thinking causally, maybe we need a little bit more than that. And so one idea here that's gotten traction in psychology of what these could look like is the idea, and again, also connecting a little bit more with physics earlier, is that to the extent that we think about the way in which people represent, the physical world, maybe that is a little bit like the way in which computer games these days model physics. Right? And I'll say a little bit more about what that means. So let's say that we, as human agents, perceive the world like through our different modalities, like in vision, audition, and haptics, let's say. But then the key idea is that we build some internal representation of the world. In this case, the internal representation of the world might feature things like objects, where objects have properties. And yes, such as location, mass, all the kind of things that you have to do when you want to compute, when you want to build a little computer game, you have to say, make this thing circular, give it that mass, give it that kind of texture, and so on. And then maybe apply some force to it to run simulations of what will happen in the future. Right? So if you have an internal representation like that, that will be extremely powerful because it will allow us to do a whole sorts of different kinds of things. So we could, for example, use it to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. It's a little small, but hopefully you can still see it. So here's saying, is this tower stable or not? We could make inferences about unobservable things, like in this case, for example, what the mass of this green object is, given that we know that the configuration is stable at the moment. We could also judge to what extent certain blocks are responsible for the stability of the tower, maybe by doing something like a mental intervention on the scene. So imagining what would happen if I remove the object from it. And that could also guide our actions that we would take. So if I wanted to make this thing more stable, where would I need to put another block, for example? So this idea of people having something like a physics engine in their mind and using that to actually make causal judgments in the world, at least as they relate to the physical world, that's what I'm going to explore and share a little bit in the next few slides, and then link it back to some of the thoughts from Jim. So here's some of the things that I do in my work. I'm interested in how people make causal judgments. And now you are my people, so you're going to be the participants. So get ready for some audience participation. It's a fairly simple one, though, I hope. So 2 balls are going to come in from the right-hand side, and I'm going to ask you whether you think that ball A caused ball B to go through the gate. Okay, so maybe we can do a show of hands. So if you do think that ball A caused ball B to go through, maybe raise your hand. So we see quite a few of the hands going up. Okay, cool. So here's what I think was going on in your mind as you were thinking about raising your arm. So not the motor part of raising your arm, but the sort of cognitive causal part. So you took in what actually happened. It's probably uncontroversial. The balls collided and it ended up going through the gate. But now here's where the interventionist counterfactual comes in. That's not enough, right? You also consider what would have happened in the relevant counterfactual situation. And here the relevant counterfactual is one like, well, if I had removed ball A from the scene, where do I think ball B would have ended up in that case? Right? And then your causal intuition, let's say in this case, really almost becomes sort of an epistemic was an epistemic definition almost of here what it means to have caused the outcome, right? So to the extent that you believe that the outcome in the actual situation, was different than the one would have been in the relevant counterfactual situation, that's what determines whether you say that it caused it to go through. And to highlight back this point here about the importance of the representation, right? So Judea Pearl and also Jim Woodward's work, we have these different representations like causal baseness, structural equations, and the do operator to think about the consequences of interventions, hypothetical or actual. But now in this case, what I'm showing in this little physics world, we actually use a sort of something like a probabilistic program. So you use the program that was used to make these little animations like of these videos. But now you have to think about what the relevant counterfactual operation like in the setting would look like, because you don't really have variables and things like that anymore. I mean, in some sense you do in the program, you have functions and so on. But one natural thing that you might do in this representation now is introduce something like a remove object operator. So now saying, oh, let me replay that world, but remove the object from the scene. So if you read Jim's book and so on, you might say, okay, well, that's intuitive. What else could you possibly be doing? That seems to be the right thing. And some other thing that's already come up, on that little illustration that I had about the different kinds of theories. Some people say, like, you don't need to do that. Like, you can get rid of the counterfactual part. All you need is there in actuality. That those are the geometric, mechanical, or kind of process theories of causation. And a nice version of that in psychology comes from Philip Wolff, and he calls it the force dynamics model of causation. And the idea is here that just different configurations of forces map onto different causal expressions, for example, that we might use to describe what happened. And here, in this case, what we might say, okay, what is the force that is associated with the patient, ball B, some force that is associated with the agent. As a result of these forces, we have a resulting force, that's how B ends up going, and then B either reaches or doesn't reach the end state. In this case, it does reach it. And because this configuration of forces now maps onto the word cause, people should say, yes, it caused it in this case. So the two theories would agree in the situation here. But I'm going to show you that I don't think that that's enough, like that looking at what actually happens is not sufficient. And there's 2 points that I want to make here. One point is that the model that I call the counterfactual simulation model has one nice consequence in that it yields very nicely quantitative predictions. And we as psychologists like that because then we can more closely relate the model to the judgments that people make. And how does it do so? Well, it does so because you don't actually have ground truth access in what this counterfactual would have been, right? It's like a possibility that could have been realized but didn't. So you have to use your intuitive understanding, your representation of the world to generate that, right? So in this case, since you don't know for sure, you have to use your internal model to run some samples to think like, oh, where do I think this would have ended up? And so this is one sample here that I'm demonstrating where I'm just now introducing noise like into this little physics program to illustrate that you don't have perfect knowledge of where this ball would have ended up, right? And here now you're unsure, well, maybe it looks like the ball would have missed. Maybe run another sample in my mind, another simulation, oh, the ball would have missed and here would have missed. So in these little simulations that I run in my mind, the ball would have missed, every time. So I'm thinking like, okay, I'm fairly certain that ball A caused ball B to go through the gate. But now if you look at a slightly different situation here, where again, A bumps into B and B goes through the gate. So the same sort of configuration of causation that we had earlier. This time though, the counterfactual is less clear, but it's not clear whether ball B would have made it or not in that case, because it was headed right to the post of the goal. And now if you run some simulations in your mind, you might say, well, no, it looks like it would have missed. Oh no, maybe it would have gone in, maybe it would have gone in anyhow. So in this case, you shouldn't really be all that certain, right, to say that yes, it caused it to go through. So that's what we checked empirically, whether that's the case. So we showed people different kinds of clips here that manipulate, how close it was, whether B would have gone in, without A being present in the scene. And then in one of the experiments, we just directly asked them a counterfactual question: would B have missed the gate? Where they say, no, it wouldn't have missed. Yes, it would have missed. And so they're pretty sure that it would have missed here. They're unsure in the middle, and they're pretty sure that it would have gone in anyhow in this clip here on the right-hand side. And then if you ask another group of participants, not telling them anything about counterfactuals, we just ask them, do you think that ball A caused ball B to go through the gate? We see that those causal judgments very closely align with the counterfactual judgments from another group of participants. And we can also use that little simulation model that draws these random noisy samples to think about what would have happened. And that yields very similar judgments in this case as well. So these were only 3 of the clips, but we had in total 18 different clips in that experiment. And you see that the counterfactual judgments here, the mean judgments shown on the x-axis and the causal judgments shown on the y-axis align very closely with one another. So giving some support for the idea that these things might be tightly linked with one another. But when we wrote this work originally, some reviewers said, well, I'm still not convinced because all the video clips that you showed us, something different was happening in each of them. And maybe there is a way of capturing them just in terms of what actually happened, and you just didn't try hard enough. So, so we tried pretty hard, but we couldn't, make it work. So we said like, okay, let's see whether counterfactuals are really necessary for these kind of judgments. So we did something slightly different, and I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation now again. Somehow these balls moved out of the way. I don't know why. So the question here is like whether A prevented B from going through the gate in this clip. So I'm just going to show you a different clip, and this time ask you whether you think that A prevented B. Okay, so who thinks that A prevented B here in this clip? There's a few hands up, but very, very few, I'd say. So I'll show you another clip. There wasn't a glitch like in that clip, so maybe I'll show it once more. If you play it via Zoom, people think like, oh, something just went wrong with the, with the screen. But you probably noticed this jump right that the ball was doing. So you might have some aha effect. Often you really only need 1-shot or 2-shot learning. So this is just a little teleport that I built, right? That if ball B goes in here in the teleport entry, it comes out of the exit in the same way in which it went in. And so this was basically me having fun with that game. But now that you know that, and again, sorry about the balls being a little bit moved here. So now if I show you exactly the same clip again, you will say, or at least my participants say, yes, it prevented it from going through. Right? Because what I did is I just changed your belief about how the world works, but I didn't tell you anything about these little objects at the beginning. But now you're counterfactual, instead of thinking the ball would have ended up somewhere there in the top left, looks like this. Right? So the fact that I can show you exactly the same clip twice, and I only change your beliefs about how the world works, and that makes a big difference to your causal judgments, sort of shows, or maybe even proves, or whatever, pretty strong version of show that it's not going to be possible to reduce causal judgments to just the information that's actually there. Right? So I don't need the teleport thing. I can also just move a block in and out of the way. That's what I did here. So either if the block is in the way here, then people don't say that A prevented B. If the block's moved out of the way, they say it prevented it. Same thing with causation, right? Same idea. So I'm going to build up, this model drawing from Jim. So we're going to get back to Jim in a second. But so far I've shown you, there's this tight relationship between causal and counterfactual judgments in this physical domain. Like also, and the kind of knowledge that I needed to represent here was more like a physics engine. So it'd be hard pressed to try to build this kind of model using structural equations and causal diagrams, because they're not particularly good at representing spatiotemporal information, essentially. And it also turns out that it looks like these counterfactuals are necessary for explaining people's causal judgments. Okay, so now there's two other chapters that I'm going to draw from. Now some additional ideas. So in chapter 3 and chapter 4, so in chapter 3, they're basically kind of methods and cogsi focused chapters like of the book. So what are the ways in which we are studying causal cognition? And then what are some of the things that empirical psychologists have found about causal cognition? And so the contrast here between the sort of armchair philosophy, then experimental philosophy with the burning armchair, as maybe you've seen, and I was on, how shall I represent empirical psychology? Well, just another piece of furniture. It's not really empirical psychology, of course, but that sort of, Jim goes a little bit into the different traditions like within these frameworks. And he's quite sympathetic, at least to the empirical psychology approach and to some of the ways in which experimental philosophy is understood, not so much to some of the other ways in which they're understood. And one of his points is really methodological, and that's also come up in Jinan's presentation. So that's a lot of like what you see in philosophy, and a lot also then sometimes in some work of experimental philosophy. So that's the experiment in some sense. You get to see like a long story like that of Billy, shooting the enemy, which would have shot Susie, and then the question is whether Billy, caused the bombing to happen if Susie was the one, like dropping a bomb. First, there's a lot of text. Also, the text has to explicitly stipulate what the counterfactuals are in this case. So that last sentence here, if Billy hadn't pulled the trigger, enemy would have eluded him and shut down Susie. So it's nice, I guess, to show that people are sensitive to these counterfactuals if, spoon-fed, but it's maybe even stronger to show that even if you don't tell them anything about counterfactuals, they are spontaneously engaging in counterfactual thinking when making causal judgments. This is a slightly different, different point, a stronger point. And then there might be like a little neurodiagram that goes with the representation like of that. So what I find appealing about the kind of video clips here that I've been using so far is, so this is a situation of double prevention. Maybe I'll show it to you once more, but I don't need any text and I don't need to tell you anything about counterfactuals, but you just see that, but you realize that, oh yeah, if B hadn't knocked A out of the way, A would have knocked E out of the way. And so I don't need, it's sort of still toy-like, right? It's still like a little video clip, but at least it allows me to look at this in a way that I don't have to tell you anything about counterfactuals. So if then a counterfactual model still works well, it's probably stronger evidence that people are doing that sort of thing. So here's another quote. So in one of those two chapters here, Jim says, I will argue that much empirical research on causal cognition is not helpfully viewed as aimed at making discoveries about the concepts of causation at all, right? Again, what causation is, but rather what it's for. Instead, the research goals are often much broader, having to do with features of causal reasoning and inference that are not plausibly viewed as part of the or a concept of causation. So, for example, the research goals may have to do with the understanding the underlying computations and representations involved in learning and reasoning. And so just to kind of, bolster that point, getting back to a little billiard ball world, right? So we might be interested in like how it is that people are now actually carrying out these inferences or these causal judgments in this case. What does the process look like? What are for the representation, right? I've argued maybe it's a little bit like a physics engine, but now what does the underlying computation look like? Right? And the model postulates some computation, right? It says people look at what actually happened, but that's not enough. They also need to do these simulations of what would have happened in the relevant counterfactual situation. And one way we can take a look at that is by doing eye tracking on participants, right? Putting them in front of a computer screen, but also now looking at where it is that they're looking and seeing whether that gives us some evidence. And that's also something that Jim, he talks about the study in his book, and it's just in general sympathetic to this sort of pluralism of methods of studying causation, right? And this is just one. Again, Bobby moved here a little bit, unfortunately. But what participants were asked in this experiment at the beginning, we just asked them whether Bobby completely missed the gate. So they would see a clip that I'm going to play at half speed. And we'll just look at what a participant looks at when they're being asked to answer this question at the end of the clip. And basically what the participant is looking at is just looking at ball A and ball B. So looking back and forth between the balls. Here now trying to sort of anticipate ball B is going to end up hitting the wall. And that's it. So mostly just looking at ball B because that's all the information they need to answer this particular question here. But now let's say that they're asked a different question instead, namely a causal question, whether ball A prevented B from going through the gate. So same video clip, different participant, different question. Right? And what you'll see here is that the looking pattern is very different. Right? So the participant is not just looking at the balls, but they're trying to anticipate not where B will end up going, but rather where ball B, if I'll play it once more, where ball B would have gone if ball A hadn't been present in the scene. Right? Like running these little simulations, like with their eyes, that are described like the model is doing. Right? And again, these participants weren't told anything about counterfactuals. We just asked them causal and prevention questions, and they spontaneously engage in this kind of looking behavior only in those conditions, not in the causal one, not in the what we call the outcome condition. So here on the left-hand side, it's just a summary now from a number of participants. If we look at their eye movements, how many of them do these sort of jump like to where ball B would have gone if ball A hadn't been there? And you see when they just asked the question about the outcome, not that many, but when they asked the question about prevention or causation here, a lot more of these kinds of looks. So many more of these, what we call saccades, so fast eye movements in that condition compared to the other. Okay, so it looks like people are also spontaneously engaging in counterfactual simulation when making causal judgments. So then also, as Jinan said, the next 3 chapters like in the book are about invariance or sensitivity of causation. And there's a lot in there, and I'm not going to pay justice like at all. And instead, I'm just going to bicker on like a little point that isn't so much point of those 3 chapters at all, but a point that I find interesting. And so this quote at least appears in that chapter, but that's not so much about sensitivity or invariance. But Jim here says, so there are many possible changes that do not seem at all unlikely or far-fetched, under which the counterfactual, if Billy were to shut down the enemy pilot, Susie would drop the bombs, would no longer be true. So you think, oh, why did I pick this quote? So the reason why I picked this quote is that I don't think that this is a counterfactual. So, and there is one of these interesting domains in which I feel, so philosophers are often like, very, good at coming up with different words for different things. And this is one where I feel sometimes that the philosophers use a term sort of more broadly, I think, that I would wish they did. And maybe that is partly due to David Lewis, because he, I think, uses it very broadly. But I think there are important distinctions to be made, and particularly in this case between hypothetical and counterfactual thinking. So I just wanted to take that as an opportunity to talk a little bit about that, because these distinctions don't appear so much in Jim's book. Partly he doesn't need them as much because his book focuses on type causation, so mostly on knowledge about reasoning from causes to effects rather than the other way around, which has been more my focus, right? Thinking about how people make causal judgments about particular things, but let me run with it anyhow. So, and I've been finding Judea Pearl's what he sometimes calls the causal ladder or the hierarchy of causal concepts to be useful in that context. So Pearl distinguishes between 3 different sort of levels of causal knowledge, you might say, where on the first level, that's just the level of association. So where you can draw associations between variables that's used for prediction and for diagnostic reasoning and so on. On level 2 is then the level of intervention. And that's the level of hypothetical thinking. So thinking about the possible consequences of taking certain actions, right? That's relevant for policy making, decision making, planning, all these kinds of things. And then on level 3 is where he says that's the level of counterfactuals. And that's the level that often we're ultimately interested in. So in answering why questions, and particularly why questions about particular things. Why did this happen? Was it this rather than that caused this to come about? Was it the aspirin that stopped my headache? Would Kennedy be alive if Oswald had not shot him? And so on. And so I take this level 2 to be the level of hypothetical reasoning, and the level 3 to be the level of counterfactual reasoning. And I want to say a little bit that I think it makes a difference. So this paper that the eye tracking stuff that I just talked about, one of the reviewers, that was the reviewer number 2, obviously. So you haven't really shown us any counterfactual simulation, that reviewer said. What you showed us instead is you showed us hypothetical simulation. Because when I showed you this, right, the eye movements moved sort of before the balls collided, right? So they were sort of anticipating a hypothetical future, you might say. It wasn't that they looked at clip until the end and then went back sort of and thought what would have happened otherwise. Right? So they said, oh, you should really call it the hypothetical simulation model instead. So what you've shown in this work is that people are computing an expectation, a hypothetical expectation, and they're comparing that to what actually happened and that's the causal judgment. No need for counterfactuals. So that's the challenge here, right? So it's saying, is it enough to just do this hypothetical? Well, would B go into the goal if A was removed, as the scene unfolds? And what I would be doing is, right, I'd be going forward in time and then thinking about this hypothetical intervention, removing the ball from the scene, and then thinking about what would happen in the future. As opposed to the counterfactual, I mean, luckily we have English that helps us mark the difference between them, like with the tenses that we can use. So would B have gone into the goal if A had been removed? So that's now a counterfactual, right? And there the idea is I take into account everything that happened, and now I go back in time, right, and think about what would have happened if some intervention had taken place, right? So it turns out in this particular setting here, that doesn't make any difference. It's the same, like whether you do this or that, like in order to drive your causal judgment, whether it's the hypothetical or the counterfactual that you're comparing it to, it's the same. So another way to put this is in a simple causal relation like this, where just one cause causes an outcome. The hypothetical, if A happened, would B happen, or if A had happened, would B have happened? It's the same thing. You need to make it a little bit more complex, not much more complex. If you add some alternative cause at the beginning that you may have some uncertainty about, that's enough to tease them apart. And I want to show you how we did that again in our experiment. So we just introduced this little block thing here, and where this block is not probabilistic, so it can stay put or it can move. And you don't know that at the beginning, whether or not it's going to move. And so now the question is, like, again, whether A prevented B from going into the goal. I'm not going to ask you this time, but if you see at the clip, the collision happened, and then this block moves out of the way, right, after the collision happens. So the idea is now, if you're running just some hypothetical simulation, right, you're playing the world forward until the kind of relevant causal event, and you're asking, would B go into the goal if A was removed? Well, now you should be uncertain, right, because it depends. It depends on whether or not that block's going to move. So my hypothetical at this point is like, maybe, right? Whereas the counterfactual at the end, because it depends on if the block moved, if the block ended up moving, then the counterfactual at the end is, yes, it prevented it. It would have gone in, because I have this additional information by going all the way until the end and then going back in time, right? So we're getting a different prediction about the kind of causal judgment that people should reach if they were performing counterfactual reasoning, or if they were only anticipating a possible future and comparing what actually happened to that. That's the idea. So we did that experimentally, just asked them asked them a hypothetical, asked them a counterfactual, or asked them to make a causal judgment for these kinds of clips. And interested in what now explains causal judgments. Is it really the counterfactuals or the hypothetical sufficient? And now I have to go a little bit quickly here, but you can kind of glimpse at that. We just showed participants a number of different situations, like one where the block was in the way, but moved out of the way. It was in the way and stayed in the way, and so on, just manipulating the different possible options. And the main thing I want you to take away from this one is just to see, if you look at the causal judgments, which are the bars here, they're very closely aligned with the counterfactuals, the red dots, and not with the blue dots, the hypotheticals. So this sort of setting also here shows that, these possible hypotheticals aren't sufficient. You really need this whole process of going all the way until the end, thinking back, and then simulating how the counterfactual would have played out. So they're predicted by counterfactual simulation and not by hypothetical simulation. This last part. Okay, so now in the last chapter, Jim talks about proportionality, right, as another important consideration when thinking about what is a useful way of representing essentially our causal knowledge of the world. So here he says, I see proportionality as one criterion among several having to do with the notion, or having to do with the choice of variables for causal analysis. The notion is applicable when we face a choice among different candidates for the cause variable for a fixed effect or explanandum, and where the candidate cause variables are themselves related in a specific way. They stand in what might loosely be described as a non-causal hierarchy of abstractness, or more or less fine-grainedness with respect to one another. Grainedness. So this is another idea that, in some sense, I didn't know about this idea before, but it's like a slam dunk, at least in terms of, I think, how it applies to some of the work that I've been doing. So I've been focusing on very simple kind of causal situations so far. But what happens if they become a little bit more complex? And with more complex, I just mean 3 balls instead of 2 balls. That's as far as I've gotten. If you invite me again, I'll talk about 4 billiard balls next time. So here's a causal chain, right, where A bumps into B bumps into E. right? And if you ask people, oh, to what extent was A the cause? To what extent was B the cause? Are we going? And it sort of looks like this here, right? Where 100 would say, yeah, very much the cause. 0 is, yeah, wasn't the cause. So that's what the judgments would look like in a case like this, right? And from all I've told you up until now, the blue one is a troublemaker. Like, why is this so high? Because remember that I had this nice remove operator and saying, oh, if you remove the thing, would it have made a difference to whether or not the outcome, would have happened? But here, if I remove the blue one, E would still have gone in, right? A would have just knocked it in. So it didn't really make a difference in terms of, whether or not it was there in the scene, in terms of whether or not you went through the gate. Here's another one. We've already seen this one. The philosophers love that one, the double prevention clip. And if we ask participants about this clip here, their causal judgments look like this, right? And the judgment for, so here the trouble is, why is it so low for the blue one? And it's not low because you think, oh, maybe people are uncertain about what would happen if ball B wasn't there. We asked them in another experiment, what would happen if ball B wasn't there? And they say, yeah, E wouldn't go in. So they know that, they know the truth of this counterfactual, but nevertheless, they give a really low judgment to this ball. So I kind of looked like this for quite some time, I would say, until I then reread some philosophy. And here are some philosophers whose work I reread. And here's a quote from Jim. So he was in a paper in 2011 arguing, so maybe some of these intuitions that are captured in this geometrical mechanical approach, maybe those can be thought of in terms of spatiotemporally organized difference-making information. So essentially difference-making at a different level of granularity. And so that's essentially then the idea that I used, right? In saying like, well, there's not one notion of causation that I'm just going to call for now weather causation, right? So that's like whether or not the ball is present in the scene, let's say. So would the outcome have been qualitatively different if ball B, let's say the one that we're interested in, had been removed from the scene? So what I do in my mind, I remove the ball and think about what would have happened in that case. But that can't be all, right? Because then I can't explain these other patterns that I've shown you earlier. But maybe there's another level, like a different sort of level of proportionality at which you could look at things. And that's the level now that we call how causation here. We call it a different aspect of causation. So would the outcome have been different if ball B had been perturbed? Like there's a different kind of intervention that you're thinking of. Now the variable is not like being there or not being there, but the variable having a slightly different value from the one that it had in the actual situation. So we introduced a different counterfactual operation, changed the object like a little bit, and seeing whether that would have made a difference to the outcome, where the outcome is also now more finely construed. Like, how would it have gone through the gate? And if you do that move, then it can help us explain why people give the kind of judgments that they do here, because A is both a how and a whether cause, because how causation is sort of transitive, it goes through the objects, whereas whether causation is not. And it can also help us explain why the judgments are so low here for ball B in this case, because it was just a whether cause, but not a how cause. That's the idea. So these were just 2 clips. In total, we had a whole bunch of clips in this experiment, but like assuming that people use this kind of intuitive physics model of the domain and that they're making causal judgments by considering different kinds of counterfactuals on that model allowed us to explain people's judgments for a whole bunch of cases, their intuitions. Okay, so I'm almost there. It's almost that time. So this idea that people consider different aspects of causation, and we can think about them in terms of proportionality, in some sense also, what's the question that they want to answer? Is it about whether or not the ball went in, or is it about how it went in? And there might be different intuitions that people have. What I like about this work that we've been developing is that also it's sort of like, as Jinan was putting it, like when you build a model like that, you kind of become a metaphysician, because you have to decide, okay, what are now the relevant, relata? What are the kind of counterfactual operations that you want to think about? And that model is sufficiently flexible to not only handle cases like this of kind of event causation, but we can also apply it to think about causation by omission. So, did B go through the gate here because A didn't hit it? Well, you can run your simulation, right, and tell me what you think. Like, would A have hitting it prevented B from going through the gate? Maybe, right? Maybe more so than if it ended up missing and I ask you, would it have gone in if it had been hit? Maybe less so, right? Or even situations like this here where there's still causation happening, I would say, even though there's nothing happening, right? There aren't any events, there aren't any forces. Like an actualist, I think, would have trouble telling why we would say that this black block here has some responsibility for the other block staying on the table, right? And the idea is that you might be answering a question like that, again, by simulating what would happen if this thing was removed. Okay, so here's my conclusion slide. So from a psychologist's perspective, I think that there's a lot of evidence that we tend to build these really rich mental models of the world. And I didn't even talk about the psychological thinking about agents part of the models. I focused just on the physical domain. Right? They're even richer when we start thinking about other agents. And then by running mental simulations on this model, we can make inferences about what happened in the past, give explanations of the present, and make predictions of the future by putting these interventions on top of our mental models of the world. And that these causal mental models are really a key building block of human intelligence. The real conclusion, of course, though, Jim has to have, and this is actually the full conclusion of the book. So the book is 400 pages long, but the conclusion is short. So, and he says here, a convention of book writing is that books should not end abruptly, but instead should have a substantial conclusion as a kind of gentle leave-taking. But this is already a long book, and I see little point in rehashing what I said earlier. My overall message has been that there's a fruitful collaborative project concerning understanding causation and causal cognition, one that draws together results from philosophy, psychology, and other disciplines like statistics and machine learning. And I hope to have convinced readers that progress on these topics can be made by cooperation across different disciplines rather than by boundary policing and strategies of dismissal. And I hope that what I've been able to kind of illustrate in this talk is some of this collaboration like happening. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening and Jim for having us here. That was 2003. This was 2021. I'm looking forward to 2039 for the next one if he keeps up the pattern. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm ready to go.
Okay, let's go. Thanks, Tobias. So it's my pleasure to introduce someone who definitely does not need introduction, particularly in this place. My colleague Jim Woodward, who is distinguished professor in history and philosophy of science. You all know Jim. He has published widely in philosophy of science on causation, laws, and in a range of areas, cognitive science, moral psychology. His interest, I mean, one of those things I've always been amazed in my interactions with Jim is the unboundedness of his interests, and not simply interest, it's also skill and competences. I mean, it's actually quite striking to have someone who can talk about philosophy of physics as the next day cognitive science and statistics. It's just studying. He wrote, he's a former president of the PSA, he wrote a classic in modern philosophy of science we talked about earlier, making things happen, and we're talking about his most recent book. Thanks, Jim, and we're going to hear his response right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you so much to my commentators who I think really did an excellent job of conveying some of the main themes of the book. I've thrown together some slides here, and my apologies, I did end up putting them together kind of at the last minute. They're rather rough, and I'm just in the last hour or so, I've made myself aware that there are some things that I say in the slides that are not quite right, but we can discuss this. So let me begin with some brief remarks about Jinan's comments and her suggestion that maybe there is in causation with the human face something like a new way of doing naturalistic metaphysics. Jinan says this, and I think this is a really striking comment or set of sentences here. She suggests that a program that looks something like this: we're interested in some concept, we make the embedded agent and the cognitive and practical activity in which the concept figures the focus of inquiry. The account should give us an understanding of what the concept is doing and the external infrastructure that supports its use, but it won't always take the form of saying that the concept represents that feature of the environment. So I found this really quite interesting, and I'm on board, I have to say, with at least a whole lot of it. As some of you probably know, I've always had a somewhat troubled relationship with metaphysics. I sometimes, or even often, think I don't quite get what analytic metaphysicians are trying to do. But at the same time, I find some of what they do, particularly thought of as projects in conceptual analysis, often quite helpful and insightful. So causation with the human face is not, at least primarily, about the metaphysics of causation, but it does gesture at, and I have been completely on board with what Jinan was saying here, it does gesture at an alternative program to standard analytic metaphysics, at least in connection with notions like cause, and maybe that this program might be generalized to other sorts of concepts of interest to metaphysicians. And here's the quote again that Jinan gives that I want to pick up on. So the quote emphasizes two things, a kind of internal understanding of the concept, the role the concept plays in the internal economy of the agent, and then this element of external support in the environment. And I think that Jinan and Tobias have said enough about the internal economy aspect of things that you have at least some sense of how I suppose that might go. But I thought it might be interesting and worthwhile to say a little bit about the external support aspect of the use of the concept, partly because this is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately. What I say about this in causation with the human face is really pretty inchoate, I think, and not terribly clear. But at present, I'm working on a joint paper with Porter Williams and Naftali Weinberger, in which we try to develop this external support idea in a little bit more detail. And let me try to say a little bit more about just what this is. Just what it is that this involves. And so the basic idea is this: there's certain kind of generic features that have to be present in a system if causal reasoning or causal analysis is going to be usefully applicable to it. So these are something like empirical presuppositions for the application of causal thinking to the system. And there are a bunch of these, and they include things like the idea that some variables in the system that you're dealing with have to be statistically or probabilistically independent of one another, or at least there have to be conditional independence relations. And it's only if this is true that you can have useful connections between probability and statistics of the sort that are embodied, for example, in the causal Markov condition, which is a kind of generalized screening off condition. Another idea is that it needs to be the case for the system that there are exogenous sources of variation in the system. So in other words, there needed to be something that kind of looks like an intervention, an unconfounded source of external variation. If everything is confounded in your system and there are no external sources of variation, then causal thinking in connection with the system becomes more and more difficult. So if you know anything about the notion of superdeterminism, which is something that is some interest to some philosophers of physics, superdeterminism is exactly the kind of possibility that I think really gets in the way of coherent causal interpretation. Another feature of the external environment that is plays a role in support. This is, again, what you might call the kind of scaffolding that Jinan talks about. Often we find, at least in our world, that we can make a split between something like the initial conditions governing the system, and on one hand, and the laws governing the behavior of the system on the other hand. We can take the same laws and combine them with a different variety of different different initial conditions. In other words, we change the initial conditions and the laws nonetheless remain the same. And we can use the laws then to calculate what will happen under a variety of different initial conditions. This contrasts with another possibility, which is that we can't make the split at all, or maybe the laws and the initial conditions are in some sense very finely tuned to one another. Change the initial conditions at all, and the laws have to change too. This, again, is a world that's unfriendly to causal analysis, at least as I understand it. In the case of macroscopic causal claims, some degree of what I call realization independence. That is, you have the same causal, macro-causal relationships holding despite changes in the in very low-level microscopic details of the system. This is required, I think, for macroscopic causal understanding. And to the extent that this is present, you're kind of able to separate the world into levels, and you can just stick your attention to what's going on at one level and not worry about the lower level, as Leo Kadanoff and Nigel Goldenfeld once memorably put it. You don't have to use quantum chromodynamics to model the behavior of a bulldozer. So in other words, the quantum chromodynamical details don't matter within a certain range for the behavior of the bulldozers. These are all things that are sort of out there in the environment that help to support the successful application of causal thinking. You might think of this in sort of adaptationist terms. There's a kind of, our causal thinking is such that we can regard it as a kind of adaptation to certain niches that are present in our environment, where the niches are provided by the satisfaction of these external support-like features that I've been talking about. So part of what I want to suggest is that there's a very interesting project at characterizing what these features are. This is something that's been pretty much unexplored by philosophers, including philosophers who are interested in causation. Is this metaphysics? Well, on the one hand, it does talk about features that are out there in the world. So when you talk about this, you're not just doing mere epistemology, which is a fairly standard form of dismissal that metaphysicians sometimes have for the sort of stuff that I like to talk about it. Metaphysics is concerned with what's out there. The external support things are out there as well. On the other hand, so that makes it maybe look like a kind of metaphysics. On the other hand, it's certainly not the kind of metaphysics that analytical metaphysicians do. Doesn't try to capture what causation is in all possible worlds. Instead, it focuses on features that are present in our world that are necessary for the application of causal thinking. And the features themselves, at least as I understand the program, are such that they can be characterized in purely naturalistic terms. So you don't need what David Lewis calls non-Humean whatnots and stuff like that. You don't need stuff like powers and dispositions and so on and so forth. So as Jinan suggests, what I am tempted to say is that all there is to the study of causation is something like, first of all, an account of causal reasoning and learning, that is stuff about the psychology of the agent and stuff about when causal reasoning and learning is reliable or not. In other words, both the descriptive and normative side of the story. And in addition to that, externally, the infrastructure project, and that's it. Nothing more needed, no further metaphysics. So Jinan also asks, how do you think about modality? When I saw this in your slides, I wasn't sure whether you were asking me personally how I think about modality, or whether it was a kind of more general question to the audience. How on earth does one think about a modality? So I wanted to say a little bit about that. I think my views about this are not quite as, they're sort of in the same ballpark as yours, but not perhaps completely identical. So Jinan makes the observation that our understanding of the world is modal through and through. And then she raises the question, but how do we understand the modal contents of concepts like law and cause and so on? And I admit to be very puzzled about this myself. And I don't have a terribly coherent story, but I have a couple of things that sort of popped into my mind, as it were, as I was constructing these slides. And so let me just try to say a little bit about this. I certainly want to say that modal claims, including claims about counterfactuals, causal claims, claims about probabilities, are the sorts of things that are truth apps. They can be true or false. They are in some way answerable to what's out there in the world. And I'm perfectly willing to say that they're informative about the world. And you're right that I should not have conflated does it represent or does it give information about. These are two, even in my own thinking, these are two very different ideas. And as I said earlier, although I want modal claims to be answerable to the world, I don't find the kinds of stories that analytical metaphysicians try to construct, for example, about powers or relations of necessitation between universals. I don't find these helpful at all in understanding in advancing my understanding of modal notions. Now, it's of course true if I make a modal claim, like if I were to drop this pencil and fall to the ground, there's going to be some deeper physical explanation for why that's true in terms of, gravitational effects and so on and so forth. But presumably this deeper physical explanation also has modal content to it. So the mere fact that the deeper physical explanation is available doesn't sort of satisfy the itch that the metaphysician has, because it doesn't tell you about what modality is or something like that. The metaphysician wants a different explanation of modality, a kind of not an explanation of modality in terms of a deeper physical story. So what can one say about modality? Well, I think part of the answer might be just to talk about the kind of project that I was sketching a moment ago. You elucidate the role that the notions play in our reasoning and our practices and so on, and you elucidate the supporting structure. This can give us some sort of purchase, perhaps, on what goes on when we make modal claims. But maybe there's a bit more to say, or let me at least try to say a bit more. And in doing so, I want to return to the concluding remark that Jinan made in that passage that I quoted a little while ago, where you say that in elucidating the concept, it won't always take the form of saying that the concept represents some feature of the environments. Let me try to take this idea, and I'm going to develop it in a direction that you, Jinan, may or may not approve of. So here's what I'm thinking. So when you're presented with a concept, sometimes it makes sense to ask whether there's some thing or entity in the world that in some way corresponds to the concept. In other words, there's a story to be told what the thing is. So for example, if you're talking about the concept of gold, this sort of inquiry, what is gold, makes perfectly good sense. It's an element with atomic number 79, et cetera, et cetera. So here we find an entity or thing in the world that the concept stands for or represents. But there are other concepts that are important in science in which it's not so clear that this sort of strategy, looking for an entity that the concept corresponds to or something like that, isn't clear that this is illuminating. I mean, you can do it in a sort of completely deflationary way, obviously, but in some sort of thicker way that you get with the gold example, it isn't clear that there's a project here to be done. So think about probability ascriptions. I certainly think they can be objective in the sense of being true or false, but it isn't clear that it makes much sense, at least to me, to ask what probability is, or at least the answer to what probability is not going to be anything like the answer to what gold is. You have the wrong model of what the inquiry should be if you think that you're going to be able to answer a question about what probability is by giving the kind of answer that is appropriate in the what gold is case. So you can talk about probability in terms of the Kolmogorov axioms, connections with frequencies established by the laws of large numbers, the roles that probability plays in reasoning, decision-making, etc. You can also ask what structures are out there in the world that support probability descriptions. So stable relative frequencies, certainly. We have a story, or actually a variety of different stories about where stable relative frequencies come from. In the case of gambling devices, there's the sort of thing that the tradition that Poincaré initiated, and understanding them in terms of the method of arbitrary functions. In the case of quantum mechanical probabilities, there's another sort of story to be told. But it isn't clear that beyond this, anything further is accomplished by saying whether well, there are special entities, there are propensities in the world, and this is what we should be identifying with probabilities. And I think it might very well be true that the same is true of modally involved notions like cause. In such cases, maybe we have objectivity and truth aptness without at least a non-trivial story about just what it is in the world that's being represented. So maybe it just as in the case of cause, asking what, just as in the case of probability, asking what the notion of cause represents in the world doesn't really have a non-trivial answer. If you're an interventionist, you can say something like, well, causation is that relationship such that when you intervene on one variable, another variable will change. But that hasn't given you anything like the kind of answer that you get when you ask what gold is. So I'm not sure that this captures anything like what Jinan has in mind, and I'm not sure that it's correct, but I'm certainly sympathetic to what I've just said, and I think it's a line of thought that's worth exploring. So somehow a notion of objectivity, informativeness about the world, but dropping the sort of strongly representational or what is it kinds of questions. I think that's, if we can make sense of that, that's the way to go. Okay, quick response to Toby. So I'm gonna, mainly because I didn't get a chance to kind of systematically respond to all of Toby's slides. I wanted to focus on this question, which I find quite interesting, of the contrast that he appeals to between counterfactuals on the one hand and future hypotheticals on the other. As he explains, this is a contrast that is, I think, in the form that we're going to be discussing, it was introduced by relatively recently by Pearl, and it's sort of Pearl's ladder, the different gradations, as it were, running from associations to future hypotheticals to counterfactuals. And as Toby alluded to, part of what's interesting here is that the typical philosophical usage is to use the notion of counterfactual in a way that it covers both future hypotheticals and what Pearl and Toby referred to as counterfactuals. So what is this difference, or what is it, how are we to understand it? And it's this that I want to try to elucidate a little bit, and I actually find myself struggling a bit with this. I think I have not got it quite right, but let me try to make some suggestions and also explain to you why at least some of the things that Pearl, for example, says about the distinction between future hypotheticals and counterfactuals are, at least for me, a little bit puzzling. So here's what I take to be the idea. So I think Toby and Pearl too seem to suggest that a counterfactual corresponds to observing this full sequence of what actually happens and then conditioning on that while assuming that some antecedent holds that's contrary to what actually happens. And then you ask what the consequence would be under the occurrence of that antecedent. So for example, we observed Jones smoked, we observed that he developed lung cancer, and then we want to ask the question, if Jones hadn't smoked, would he have developed lung cancer? So in other words, we're making the counterfactual involves an antecedent that is contrary to what is actually observed. And by contrast, a future hypothetical on this sort of view takes a form like, if Jones were not to smoke, he would not develop lung cancer, perhaps asserted in a context in which it's not known whether or not Jones smokes and develops lung cancer, or at least we don't take this into account. And supposedly the difference here is that this latter thing, the future hypothetical, can be captured just in terms of Pearl's do operator, So this is just the operator that basically says there's been an intervention on the variable x. What's the probability of y given that you do x, perhaps conditional on some other variable z, but where z is not in any way inconsistent with whatever else is being assumed in the counterfactual. The notation that is required to capture the counterfactual notion, by contrast, is a little bit more complicated because, as you see here, you're conditioning on what's actually observed, and then imagining that you have a conditional with an antecedent, which is different from what's actually observed. And let me explain why I find this a little bit puzzling, or at least by itself, it seems to me it doesn't really fully capture what I think the intended difference is in these in the two cases. So suppose I have a pen in my hand and I say, call this 3, if I were to release the pen, it would fall to the ground. You don't know at this point whether I'm going to drop it or not. So this sounds, given the characterizations above, like a future counterfactual. Okay, suppose by contrast, I hold out the pen, I then put it in my pocket, don't release it, doesn't fall to the ground. And then I say to you, you know, if I had released this pen, it would have fallen to the ground. Well, that's a counterfactual now, given the characterization, rather than a future hypothetical. But it's hard for me, in any case, to see exactly what the difference is here. It looks as though in both cases, I'm dealing with a conditional that seems to behave in exactly the same way, even though in the latter case, when I put the thing in my pocket, it's supposedly a counterfactual, and in the former case where you don't know what I'm going to do yet, I'm just saying if I were to release it, it would fall. It's a future hypothetical. So that's part of what's puzzling me here. But nonetheless, I agree completely with Toby that there are important differences here of some kind. I think the differences are there regardless of whether the language of future hypotheticals versus counterfactuals is the right way of capturing what's going on. So let me try to briefly indicate here's an alternative take, or I'm not even sure that it's an alternative, because you, in your oral remarks, you briefly describe things in the way that I'm just about to describe them. So maybe there's really no disagreement here. I find it natural to think about the kind of contrast that I think Toby has in mind in terms of a contrast between two different kinds of causal inquiries. So in other words, we're asking, there are different kinds of causal questions we might be asking. One involves what you might call effect to cause reasoning. So I'm going to draw a contrast between effect to cause reasoning and cause to effect reasoning. I think this is an interesting contrast, and again, it's something that's relatively neglected in philosophical discussion. So in effect to cause reasoning, what goes on is that one knows that some effect has occurred. So for example, you know that ball A has gone through the gate, you know that Jones has developed lung cancer, and then what you're trying to do is to reason backwards from that effect to whatever it is that caused it. Jones has developed lung cancer. You're trying to reason back and ask, well, what caused Jones' lung cancer? Was it smoking? Was it something else? And in this sort of case, asking whether the effect would not have occurred if some earlier event, like Jones's smoking, had not occurred, is kind of a reasonable way of getting at the causal question. And if the answer to the conditional question is yes, if it's true that if Jones hadn't smoked, he wouldn't have developed lung cancer, then if we're dealing with a case in which there aren't complications present, like various kinds of preemption or overdetermination possibilities, then there's reason to think that you can conclude if the conditional is true, then C cause D. So that's an effect to cause reasoning. Cause to effect reasoning, that's the characterization suggests, goes in the other direction. And these are the cases which I think we naturally associate with future hypotheticals. Here, the direction of inference is the opposite from what it was from the in the effect to cause case. It has to do with whether we're given some candidate cause, and what we want to know is whether it has certain kinds of effects. Okay, so we begin with C, and we're interested in whether it's going to produce some kind of effect, E. Here, the conditional that is kind of naturally associated with this does seem to me to be what Toby and Pearl referred to as a future hypothetical. And notice that in this case, you're not conditioning on information about whether or not the effect has occurred as you are in the effect to cause reasoning. You don't know what the effect is going to be. You want to know whether the cause produces the effect, and that's something that you want to discover. So a paradigm case of this second sort of conditional, the second sort of conditional now being the future hypothetical is something like a randomized control experiment. You're testing a drug in an RCT to determine whether it causes recovery from disease. If the RCT is properly conducted, this can warrant conditionals that look like future hypotheticals. So for example, if you do an RCT and you find a higher incidence of recovery in the treatment group as opposed to the control group, then you can certainly infer that if everyone in the entire experiment were given the treatment, the incidence of recovery would have been higher. Now note that this thing, what you do when you're carrying out an RCT, corresponds apparently to the second level of Pearl's ladder. Okay, and Pearl, in fact, even suggests at one point that RCTs do give you information that just corresponds to the second level. But notice that this condition, so the conditional here is a future hypothetical, but notice that it's associated with a causal conclusion. At the very least, a conclusion about the average causal effect of a drug or something like that. So it's not true that all causal claims need to be understood in terms of counterfactuals, where this corresponds, where this contrasts with future hypotheticals. Some causal claims, namely like the ones that I just described, can be understood in terms of future hypotheticals. On the other hand, notice the following, and I think this is where something like the contrast between a counterfactual and a future hypothetical really has some bite. Notice the following important fact. If one is interested in an effect to cause inferences, this is not, you can't get the answer just by doing an experiment of the sort described. So suppose, for example, Jones is a participant in the experiment that I just described. He's treated with the drug and he recovers. We observe his recovery. And we observe that he's been treated with the drug, and we want to know whether Jones's treatment caused his recovery. Where we suppose the relevant counterfactual is something like if Jones had not received the drug, he would recover or would not have recovered. You want to be able to evaluate that counterfactual. Except in rather special circumstances, an RCT is not going to allow you to answer that question. So you can't answer the question about what caused, whether Jones would have recovered if he'd been in the control group rather than the treatment group, just from the result of the experiment. So there is a real difference here, and there are certain kinds of questions that don't appear to be answerable, at least by the direct application of, anything like an RCT. And of course, the reason why this is possible is at least if it's true that there are some people in the control group who are going to recover even without the treatment, and this is going to be the usual case, we don't know whether Jones is the sort of person who would have recovered as others in the control group did without treatment, or whether Jones is the sort of person who would not have recovered without treatment. We need additional information of some kind to settle that question. Now, as you perhaps have noticed, the difference between the two inquiries I've been talking about, effect to cause and cause to effect, seems to be at least closely associated with a contrast between what philosophers anyway describe as two kinds of causal claims. There are so-called type causal claims. Do X's cause Y's? Does smoking cause lung cancer? And then there are so-called token or actual cause claims. Did Jones's smoking cause his lung cancer? At least as a general rule, the type causal claims, at least very, very often, seem to involve cause to effect reasoning. The token causal claims at least often involve effect to cause reasoning. And what we have just seen is that one can be in a position to assert a type causal claim without being in the position to assert the associated actual cause claim. And I think that's part of what's going on in any event in Pearl's ladder. So in his ladder, he makes a big deal of the idea that the information that's required at the sort of, as it were, third level of the ladder, the level associated with counterfactuals, is stronger than the information at either of the lower two levels. And I think that's completely right. You need more information to answer whether these actual cause claims are hold or not. So as Toby notes, and I think you can see it from the experiments that he describes, the cases in which the two kinds of reasoning most clearly come apart, that is cause to effect and effect to cause, are cases in which several different factors are present which may cause an effect. We know the effect is present, but we don't know which of those factors did cause the effect. And we have sort of cases like this, and then we have cases in which we're just looking forward from the occurrence of the cause to the occurrence of the effect, and we're just assuming that no other factors that might have caused the effect are present in the circumstances in question. So when Jones has lung cancer and he smokes, we're immediately faced with the question, well, was it the lung cancer, or was it the smoking, or was it perhaps something else? Maybe he was exposed to asbestos or something like that. So we don't know, unless we can somehow answer that question, we don't know what would have happened with respect to Jones's lung cancer if he hadn't smoked. In the usual case in which we engage in cause to effect reasoning, we're typically thinking about it in terms of a single cause being present, like smoking, and then we're asking what the effect of that is. So the complications that go along with the presence of other possible causal agents are not operative. There's another contrast which Pearl also emphasizes, and I think this is quite important also, is that to evaluate actual causal claims, you at least often need to have some sort of explicit causal model that specifies in a functional form and other things. And you see this, of course, in the various models of actual causation that have been proposed in the philosophical and computer science literature, where at least if you're doing it within a structural equations framework, you have to write down a very explicit model. You don't need such a model to evaluate at least the simple forms of do C's cause E kinds of questions. These are more model free. So in a way, this shouldn't be surprising. If you think about actual causal claims, it's characteristic of them, however in detail you want to analyze them, that they have something to do with, what factor made a difference in the actual circumstances, where actual circumstances can be specified in various ways. But in any event, we're thinking about what the difference-making factor was in a sort of very concrete, specific context. And that's what, kind of triggers the interest in a counterfactual as opposed to a future hypothetical, supposing that contrast makes sense. By contrast, when we're looking at a type causal claim, we tend to abstract away from all that detail about actual circumstances. So for example, when we ask about whether smoking causes lung cancer, we're not asking anything about the causation of lung cancer in any particular person. So my suggestion is that what I said earlier was, maybe we shouldn't be thinking in terms of a contrast between two different kinds of conditionals. Maybe it's okay to think that way, but we should also be thinking in terms of a contrast between two different kinds of causal inquiries that require different kinds of information. And I think this is part of what's going on in this pearl ladder kinds of things. So I'm going to conclude in a moment here. Tobias, why I didn't distinguish in my book between future conditionals and counterfactuals. Part of my response, I guess I was just kind of lazy. I also thought that causation with the human face was already rather long and it didn't need an additional level of complication. But in addition, my primary focus in causation with the human face was trying to understand type or generic level causal claims rather than actual cause claims. And for the purpose of understanding the actual cause, the generic or type level causal claims, it doesn't seem that the contrast between future hypotheticals and counterfactuals matters so much. It doesn't matter much just for exactly the reasons that I've been describing. The contrast seems to come into play most interestingly when you're thinking about actual causal claims. So Toby also suggests, and here we make a connection with some interesting experimental results and indeed an ongoing dispute particularly in developmental psychology. So Toby suggests that the contrast between future hypotheticals and counterfactuals is important for the interpretation of experimental results, particularly in connection with issues about whether young children understand counterfactuals and connect them to causal claims. And put generically, the basic worry here is that the experiments that have been taken to show that children of some relatively young age, like maybe 3 or 4 or whatever, understand counterfactuals. Maybe at best, all those experiments show is that the children understand future hypotheticals, okay? And I agree that this is an important question. It would be worth revisiting some of these experiments with this distinction in mind and exploring things a little more carefully. But I also wanted to note that Toby doesn't, he didn't refer to these experimental results in his presentation, but the experimental results that are interpreted as showing that children don't understand counterfactuals and maybe they just understand future hypotheticals at best. These experimental results are contested. Okay, so there are people like is it Sarah Beck on the one side who think that children, at least at ages 3 and 4, maybe even a little older, don't really understand counterfactuals. They're on one side. On the other side, it's Alison Gopner and her students like Tamara Kushner, who think that counterfactuals are perfectly well understood by younger children. Here's so the issue is contested, but what I want to say about this is even if it did turn out to be true that young children understand only future hypotheticals and they connect these with type level causal claims, which seems to be the appropriate conditional for understanding type level causal claims. And it is pretty clear that they do this. But even if this was true, but they didn't understand counterfactuals before, say, age 6 or so, this wouldn't concern me much. what I would take this to show is simply that children's ability to make actual cause judgments, particularly in complex cases in which there are multiple candidate causes or a determination and so forth, it just comes in developmentally later than a more general ability to make type cause judgments. And if this is true, it would be an important fact about the development of causal cognition. But as far as I'm concerned, this is all that it would show. In fact, I find this developmental claim about the generic or type notion coming in before the ability to make at least complicated actual cause judgments. I find this actually pretty plausible. And in fact, it fits together, I think, rather naturally with one of the claims that I make in Causation with the Human Face. It's not one of the main claims, but it's nonetheless something that I say. I claim there that actual cause claims are less central and important in causal reasoning and understanding causation than many philosophers suppose. So there's a tendency, particularly in the metaphysics literature, to think that actual causation or actual cause judgments is the fundamental notion, and everything else is built out of that. I'm not convinced either as a kind of normative matter in terms of reasoning about causation, or as a matter of the empirical psychology of causal cognition, that actual cause judgment is fundamental in the way that many suppose. I see reasoning about actual causes as a very specialized and complicated practice influenced by many, many different factors, and in fact, very, very hard to successfully model. There are all sorts of candidate models out there, particularly in kind of the structural equations tradition now of actual cause judgment. Joe Halpern, as you were saying, has a whole book on it. None of these models seem to adequately capture the full range of our actual cause judgments. By contrast, I think we have a much better kind of theoretical and normative handle on the more type level claims. And part of what I did in Causation with the Human Face was to appeal to considerations like this to justify my comparative neglect of actual cause reasoning in that book. And so if the actual cause notion is in some way less central and more specialized than the more generic notion, then that is, so to speak, is sort of grist from my mill in terms of the focus that I have in Causation with the Human Face. So let me just stop at this point, and again, thank you very much for your comments.
15-20 minutes for questions. Please, why don't you just join at the table and Rob, go for it.
So, lots of things I'd like to ask. So thanks very much. Jim, I just want to ask you a question about this. I think you may have answered it, but please say something else. So your book is Causation with a Human Face. Your book is Causation with a Human Face.
Yes.
But of course, many of these things, for their functional role, play a difference for animals as well. And I was going to ask, to what degree one could just replace their title and just say that this would be true and correspondingly do this for animals, or whether there's something that really is distinctively human about it. Mentioned the thing about adaptive part, and it seems to be that would indicate that it is something we could just map over. But do you think that there is something that's special about the human case, or
yes? The answer is yes. And I think just as an empirical matter, human beings, and including relatively young children, have capacities for causal reasoning that other animals, including other primates, don't seem to have. And the differences take a variety of forms. By and large, although this is disputed, there's relatively little evidence that other animals are, for example, sensitive to the difference between what's called conditioning on a variable and intervening on a variable. So the whole kinds of inferences that go along with sensitivity to that distinction are apparently unavailable to other animals. So the short answer to your question is that there's a bit in the book about causal cognition involving other animals, but I think there's lots of evidence that human beings really are distinctive. Even other primates, including, for example, chimps, are, from our perspective, not very good causal reasoners. They do a lot of things that just don't make much sense from our perspective.
If I could just ask Toby then, is there anything where there's an animal case that you could do with your balls, fetch you over and
Say that.
I'm asking Toby whether there's a case with animals where you could do that same kind of experiment as in the hypothetical fetching wall.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's one recent study, like with primates, that's interesting, that shows that they do appreciate the basically whether in this case, the experiment, what their space of alternatives was essentially. So if you have a primate and you give them one object that they don't like as much, but if the alternative is unavailable to you, either because you physically can't get there, or it's clear from the primate's perspective that you are ignorant of that alternative, they're much more likely to accept it than when you had a better alternative that was available to you. So that shows at least an appreciation, right, for modals, sort of in that sense, right? Okay, are you giving me sort of the best you could have in this particular situation? Now, so that's still, though, I think, at this kind of level 2, I would say, like on false hierarchy. So I've been trying to get young children, right, as Jim was saying, like to see whether I can get some demonstration that they are already engaging in counterfactual reasoning. I haven't thought too hard about how to try and do it, with with primates or with other animals like dogs, and partly also it's like to do with the question, and that's also something that I still have for Jim, and maybe we can mull over a little bit more over dinner. Like, it's very clear to me like how this type level 2 reasoning is extremely useful, like to be able to think about the consequences of certain actions that I might have. It's less clear to me how, from a learning story, that third level is useful, right? The counterfactuals are useful to give blame to someone, or maybe in language to communicate to someone, oh, this happened because of that, but if because partly means the truth of the counterfactual. But what role it plays, like just on the individual level in learning about the world, that is less clear to me. And then maybe in these other animals, right, where maybe communication is a little bit limited, right, maybe that level of, like, having that level of knowledge is not required as much as it is for us. But that's only thinking out loud. Kind of.
That's something that I find puzzling too, and it is, I think, echoed in a lot of the current discussion, particularly of actual causation in the philosophical literature, but also in other literatures that are concerned with actual causation coming out of, for example, computer science and machine learning, and that is, what is the function, so to speak, of the actual cause notion? But that it's not. I think we don't very clearly understand that, and that's related to your observation. What exactly is it giving us in addition to we get just from Burroughs level 2? It's presumably giving us something, but I think we don't have an entirely clear handle on just what more is involved.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I have questions too, like one for you.
We'll start with one. There's a lot of people.
Okay, then we'll sorry. No, that's the other one later. So yeah, going back to your distinction between future hypotheticals and counterfactuals, it seems to me first that it's the real distinction that was about knowledge, so what they knew. So before it happened, so you presented it as if that distinction was between like about time, like whether it's before or after it happens. But really what was happening, it seems to me, is that early they didn't know that whether the block will go up, right? And so all they knew is like it may go up, but after it happened, they knew that it would have gone up, right? And so really what happens, you can say that people make causal judgments with like full information future hypotheticals. So if they have the true future hypotheticals, then that's enough, right? But then you don't want to. So there is no distinction between, this distinction between counterfactuals and future hypotheticals doesn't play a role. The second remark on the same experiment is that actually there is a causal concept out there under deterministic causation. It's called where the two hypotheticals that they were entertaining, which is I think when I was looking at the graph was it may or may not go for the hole if B doesn't hit A, but it won't go for the hole if B hits A, is enough on this causal concept to say that B caused A not to go for the hole. So on both like A and B on both those points, it seems that there is no distinction that makes any role between counterfactuals and hypotheticals.
So maybe I'll take the second one first because I think that's easier. So then the claim, right, that I'm trying to make is like actually mapping onto some quantitative judgment, right? So you might say, because I understood your second part to be like, oh, it's fine if they're just uncertain about the first, and then they're certain that that's enough to license, right, the causal judgment in this case. If I understood the second part correctly, right, that they're thinking at the beginning it may or may not, and then sort of it happened, and that's enough. But what I'm trying to do really is to map sort of more quantitatively, right? If that's the case, then their causal judgment should be around like 0.5. But if they're really certain, then it should be 1 or 0, right? But maybe now getting to your first part of it, I think in this case you're right? It is really about what it is that they know. It's not so much about the different levels of knowledge in the sense of like how good is my causal model of the world, right? That's sometimes the distinction I think between level 2 Perl and level 3 Perl. But one is like I have all the structural equations, so I know all the possible things. Whereas on the other level, I don't have them all, right? I only really have maybe a causal base net, and all it allows me to do is think about the consequences of an intervention. That's not the distinction in my case, right? Because my participants know how physics work, right? How this intuitive physical example works. So I think it is really there mostly a differentiation about what it is that they know, but then it still shows, right, that people are capable like of taking all the knowledge that they accumulate over the time of what happens into account and go back and consider this counterfactual. So yeah, so I think it still shows that like this whole process, like that Pearl postulates, like is involved. It's also true, as you're saying, that if I were to postulate the hypothetical and I'd fill in all the unknowns, it would be the same. But if I asked you, oh, do you think, A would cause B to go through the gate if the thing moved out of the way, right? If I remove all the uncertainty, then they align again. So yeah, so I think the mapping is not 100% clean, I think, between kind of my experiment, where the difference between counterfactual and hypothetical is really one about sort of partial versus full knowledge of the relevant information, as opposed to what is even the level or depth of causal understanding that I have about the domain, which sometimes is the difference in Pearl, right? And partly it's also, again, these causal these basis and structural equations, they aren't all that great at representing time, but I think that's part of where the problem of the mapping comes from. So yeah, those are some thoughts.
All right, we are at 5:30 and it was supposed to stop at 5:30, but we'll take 10-15 more minutes if you're okay with that. Take a few more questions. Actually, a lot of interest in more questions.
Oh, sure, of course.
I mean, if you need to leave, of course, please feel free to.
Already
Yes, please. But Sanders, you were next.
Thanks. I have a question for Jim. Both Jinan and you mentioned probability several times in your talk, including analogy between causation and probability. In fact, Jim said, particular point to understand probability, and functionalistic balance is most sensible as well. I want to draw that analogy a bit further. What happened with probability is that at some point we developed actions and a formalism to think about that, which in certain ways independent of the empirical justification of notion of probability. In fact, the norms for that derive from those actions confront any empirical justification, as is the case with the observation by Kahneman and Gerstenberg about how people make mistakes regarding probability. Jim points to that example as well. I'm wondering, could something like this happen as well for actual causation? We have a particular formal axiomatic approach, which gives us a new dimension of norms, which might even trump empirical justificatory norms in certain cases. And it's that a project which seems tenable And you welcome to that.
So I'm not entirely sure that I understood all of your question, partly because of defects in my hearing, but is the question partly whether we might develop a normative theory of actual causation and then find that people don't conform to that normative theory very
In
well?
particular, a normative theory based on actions, or if that's too ambitious, principles, which have a certain formal coherence above any empirical justification. Just as we have done with probability, the actions of probability have a prescriptive status over and above any empirical use that we might have. And it's now a mathematician's job in a way to tell us what probability are. So something along that lines, could that happen perhaps for actual causation?
Well, so it's certainly my view that when it comes to normative justification in connection with actual causation, or for that matter, any causal notion, it's not just a matter of fitting people's actual judgments. It's as I try to argue in the book, the way in which you give a normative justification for a theory about causal reasoning is in terms of a broadly means-end framework. So you have some sort of notion of the goal or end that you're trying to achieve. Maybe it's trying to figure out what would happen if you were actually able to carry out an intervention, and then the question then becomes, does a certain reasoning strategy lead you reliably to that goal or not? So it's certainly the case that it might turn out, both with actual causation and with other sorts of forms of causal reasoning, that normatively people ought to do such and such, but in fact they do something completely different. I think the problem, or one of the problems with actual causation, is we don't really have a good normative theory about it, because this goes back to the question, we don't really understand what the so-called goal or function of actual causal judgment is, or maybe there's several different goals or functions that relate to one another in complicated ways. So, I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, but we might very well have a functional story about actual causation that relates it to a certain goal, and then we might look and see what people are doing, and we might find that they don't, in their actual cause judgments, fulfill that goal very well. So that strikes me as a very real possibility. So I'm going to take just one example. One proposal that's been made, as you know, about a goal or function associated with actual cause judgments is that we single out as actual causes those variables that are the most effective targets of intervention in the particular circumstances that we're talking about. Okay, effective targets of intervention if you want to in some way modify the effect, either prevent it from happening or maybe make it happen or something like that. Now, if that's the goal, a lot of people's, at least in some contexts, people's actual cause judgments don't seem to align with that goal very well. And I'm particularly thinking, for example, of things like investigations into the actual causes of accidents, like industrial accidents, where people tend to focus on the most proximate causes of the accident, often involving human error in their judgments of actual causation, when in fact the more effective targets of intervention in many cases would be much more systemic factors that are not the way in absence of adequate fail-safe capacities on the part of the plant or something like that, or failure of adequate training, safety training in the personnel and things like that. So that's the case, given a certain target for what an actual cause judgment does, that people's the judgments that people make actually seem like normatively not such great judgments.
So we'll leave it at that. David, do you want to go next since Mike is with you? And we should leave pretty soon because the staff will have to put the room in order. So shorter question and shorter answer. Not too much pressure on all of you. Go for it, David.
So this is to Jim and Nan. Predictably, I'm wondering about quantum mechanics. So the thought is, I can see the case for saying, if I've got if I've got all the frequency data, none of that's the probability, and why hypothesize something else that should be the probability? It's less clear in quantum mechanics. If I've got the quantum state of some system and measure, this quantum state determines the single case probabilities. And we've got pretty good grounds for thinking quantum state representation. So then what's the case for not just identifying the probabilities with those features of the quantum state, at least in the quantum case?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I think I would say in that case, sure, if the world is quantum mechanical and the wave function is a real object, then you do have an identity in that case. I don't know whether that would count as a reduction on grounds that I think even if the world were different than that and you had to stabilize relative frequencies, you would still have probabilities.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of a classical object like a roulette wheel, for example, and if you agree that it makes sense to attribute probabilities to outcomes of that, I don't know whether you would accept that or not. Then it's a little less clear, I think, what it is that you. There doesn't seem to be some well-defined thing that you're going to identify the probability with, I guess, is my reaction.
Siddharth, go for it.
Thanks. My question is mostly for Jinan. So I wanted to ask you about this broad methodology of metaphysics with the human face. And I wanted to raise one concern for it, which is that I worry that it makes some of our metaphysics incorrigible in the following sense. So suppose I want to do a metaphysics of good in which I focus on the functions that the word good plays in the human community. And then that community has what we would consider fairly problematic views that the function that the word good plays in that community is to reinforce the power that aristocrats have over serfs or something like that. Or the function that the word knowledge plays in a certain community is to signal affiliation with some cult. So you believe that aliens created us because that's what, and you say you know that because that will allow you to get ahead in that cult. So I'm just curious, wouldn't that, but we want to say that, no, those are just bad analyses of good or no, or not the right metaphysics of it. So, but I don't see your methodology sort of allowing us to be corrigible in that sense. Thanks.
So I guess what I would say in a case like that is, so the problem isn't with the methodology, the problem is they're introducing concepts that license inferences that are based on false beliefs. So the problem isn't that the methodology is telling you don't have anything in the world that good represents. It's rather that you can have concepts that are doing bad things. And particularly you have concepts that are licensing inferences that are leading to either false conclusions or that are, in a completely different way that doesn't support the word false, but leading to bad outcomes in practical ways.
I feel like a tyrann.
So I guess one way of responding was, suppose there was a thing in the world that was objectively identifiable with good. Would that help with the kinds of worries that you have? I don't think that it would, but anyway.
Mark, do you want to join us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, we can't hear you. I think it's then can we do something about it? No, Mark, we can't hear you. Wait a sec.
He's muted right now.
Yeah, no, he was not a minute ago.
How about
Still can't hear. All right, Mel. Try. Before it, Mark, say something?
Hello.
Yeah, it's me.
Oh, it's muted. The computer's muted actually. Like if you go all the way on the bottom
Okay,
right.
on the bottom right, the
The
system.
computer, the system. not
Bottom
the
right. Oh, there it is. Oh, okay. Sorry about that, guys. Go for it, Mark. Now we'll be able to
Okay.
hear you.
well, I don't know if all that, whether my comment's worth all that, but it is just a comment. But this distinction that just came up strikes me as pretty similar to the distinction between a direct and a direct and an inverse problem in mathematical physics, where you have a process going forward in time that degrades information so that you'll get, say, an image on a screen that could have come from quite different sources, but because of blurring, the image winds up looking so similar you can't determine the difference. And since that comes up in tomography and all sorts of practical things, to solve it, you need a lot of extra information about the probability of origins, right? And so that seems to be more probably what's going on at root. And perhaps developmentally, children are going to have a lot harder time getting the concept of what you have to search for in the case of resolving an inverse problem than a direct problem.
I completely agree. In fact, as I was trying to puzzle out this distinction and what was involved in it, the idea that the effect to cause reason is basically just an inverse problem did occur to me. I think that's completely correct. And inverse problems, as you say, are hard. And it's not surprising that it's only later that children show any kind of real capacity to deal with them. So I agree.
Small comment on that though is like that. I agree on the comment too, but there's also this other intuition, which is when I'm reasoning hypothetically, there's a lot of uncertainty that's involved in that, right? If I think, for example, like, oh, should I take the train or the car tomorrow for work, right? Well, I don't know, like there's a lot of things can happen, right? Whereas then once something has actually happened, right? Then thinking about what would have happened if I had done something different, a lot of the uncertainty has been removed. Right, I might be able later to tell like, oh, actually, if I were taking the train, that would have been much better because there was a traffic jam and so on. So there's sort of interesting, I guess, clash here, like between on the one hand, yeah, the inverse problem in general tends to be hard, but also, at least in Pearl's calculus, like whenever I have the counterfactual level, I will end up almost always getting to situations of more certainty than when I'm reasoning hypothetically, just because there's so many factors that I don't know about. And that's what I was thinking on a more process level, which might be part of the learning story for us as we sort of like grow up, this capacity to, be able to think through things, but only then when we're not overwhelmed by uncertainty. And that counterfactual reasoning gives us that because it just fixes a lot of the things.
And you have the last question.
This is mostly for Jinan. Is there an open question over what grounds the truth of causal or counterfactual claims that isn't answered by James Campbell or isn't answered to your satisfaction?
Sorry, is it answered by what?
If there's a question over what grounds the truth of causal or counterfactual claims that Jinan thinks is not answered by your account or isn't answered by your account to her satisfaction.
Well, so I don't. Oh, sorry. I didn't. Yeah, please go ahead. No. You go ahead. I don't want to. I want to stay away from that question.
Completely answered to my satisfaction. So there isn't any outstanding question about causation, I think, in that sense.
All right, I think it's time to stop. Let's thank our three speakers today. Thanks for